2001. So the polemic was driven against modern urbanism, which is fundamentally based on humanist principles that put people at the center of the discipline and deal with functions, communities, or identities. I mean, we are now victims of all these identity politics every day. And so the idea of this proposal was that in the current ecological concerns of climate change and the rise of intelligent machines, probably the city has to face a kind of post-human stage. My engagement with technologies runs also deep, and this is also related to one of the moments that Carlo cited, the Venice Biennale in 2014, in which was the origin of a project on the envelope, which is about to be published by Akhtar, in which what we tried to do, or the core of the project, was the realization that actually the elements, the technologies in the buildings are much more interesting than the buildings themselves, and that we suspected, it was a kind of epiphany, suspected that that is because the issues that are dealt with on the scale of the detail of the technology are much more significant than the issues that we normally deal with when practicing architecture. I mean, this is the way we used to draw facades, or we draw facades. Mullions are double lines running down a facade that explain a certain composition, rhythm, language, etc., etc. But actually, within these two lines, there is a whole world of cold bridges and drainage channels and thermal barriers and mechanical fixings and air leakage and waterproofing seals that I think are right now dealing with the most politically charged issues, which are air, water, energy, and biomass, which is maybe the technology that we are going to be dealing with. So urban environments are politicizing those elements, those natural elements, and they are dealt with by these assemblages of materials that compose architecture. So it was a kind of focus on these maybe technologies, hidden technologies of architecture. This interest in technology and science has been substantially enhanced by my partner, Maider Yaguno, who is an architect but also a scientist who specializes in urban environments, and has been crucial in this kind of radicalization of our practice toward a technological edge. And one of the things that she has been doing is to develop these mobile sensing technologies to acquire urban microclimate data to high spatiotemporal resolution through a number of kits that can be mounted on vehicles and that are basically producing images of urban environment. So we are also starting to deal with that type of concerns and how to, through AR devices, how to make those data available to a wider public. Some of them were displayed or tested for the first time in the Seoul Biennale in 2017. But let me kind of go to the core of the presentation, which is this concern with green infrastructure in cities, and let me go back to a place where many of our concerns emerge from, which is the city of Shenzhen, where we entered a competition in 2013 that was aimed to propose ideas for the development of a very large new downtown, which is now well underway, the super headquarters base, and into which we proposed this idea of an eroded urbanism that came very much maybe from some of Maider's concerns with air and flows and environment. So we envisioned the project as a kind of eroded fabric that we modeled using this tool, which she has constructed, joining a wind tunnel with a robot that allows us to do tests and assess volume and shape parameters of urban fabrics in order to understand how urban fabrics behave as generators of urban microclimates. And so through this tool and some CFD modeling tools, we produce this eroded fabric for the super headquarters. That I think was a very important moment in the development of all these ideas about green infrastructure, because they started to produce this image of a ruin, of a city eaten by vegetation. The vegetation was obviously aimed to produce certain microclimatic effects on the city, but the erosion, the conflict between solids and flows in the city, together with this addition of a layer of biomass, became obviously a kind of dystopian image of a city that didn't win the competition, but nevertheless it was important in triggering a whole research on this kind of convergence or marriage between vegetation and urban structures. And alongside these explorations, we also explore other ideas of urban mobility, electromobility. I mean, it's interesting to see these images back. These images were done in 2013, and there were lots of people with masks. For some reason, we were also concerned with air. We were concerned with a kind of micromobility as the future of the city, drones delivering food, things that we are slowly becoming part of, and that we think are what we call the city of the near future. We are not interested in visionary futures. We are interested in the near future, and we were interested in this, and to some degree, it is already happening. These are some other explorations of similar themes that we did through other unsuccessful competitions, but nevertheless important in constructing a whole narrative and a whole set of tools to deal with these projects. This was also in Seoul. It was the redevelopment of the Sewun Sangha. You see the same people with masks walking around. This is Sewun Sangha. You may have seen this before. It's a megastructure built by Kim Soo-gun in the 1970s that we proposed to turn into a kind of artificial sierra linking Namsan Mountain with Yungjeong-dong Park in central Seoul. So two major urban green spaces linked by this line of buildings turn into a sierra that was obviously create certain effects. It would absorb water, it would evapotranspirate, it would absorb particles, and it would obviously produce oxygen and absorb carbon. So these undeniable positive effects that the integration of green into infrastructure was part of this investigation that was designed by a system of cables that made the substructure, proposed the substructure of this green sierra, which was a kind of upscaling of a project that we did in Spain in La Rioja, which was basically a building covered by a vineyard. You may know that La Rioja is a major wine producing region in Spain. So in this case, the cables were making a structure that would allow plants to grow around the building, and the same thing was basically reused or redeployed in Seoul to make this artificial sierra, in which the cables were actually not only acting as the substructure to the growth of plants, but also in order to hang bridges and run public spaces along this infrastructure. The other project was a proposal for the Gangnam Intermodal Station in Seoul in 2017, where the greening of the infrastructure was actually happening underground. So there was a major new transport facility being planned, and in some ways our project was about bringing daylight and air, fresh air, and also greenery very deep down into the transport infrastructure. And obviously many of the tools that we have been developing in order to analyze those environments became very important in making sure that these spaces were designed in order to provide these natural qualities to bring these natural qualities into the underground of the city. So again, you know, the whole dystopian, I think, world of the city covered with green is something that is very much part of this aesthetic, but also ecological perspective that we are trying to develop on architecture, and that recycles some of our earlier work in which we had been making projects that already integrated, were reliant on the integration of green biomass into the architecture itself, that now has become, I mean, this is one of the latest experiments. It's a small villa in the south of Spain, shaped with balloons, but where actually the idea is that the surface is supposed to become literally part of the surrounding nature, and so this kind of aggressive biological exploration is very much part of the world that we are involved in doing now. And the final iteration of this, or the most recent iteration of these explorations, has led us to win in a kind of interesting paradox or parabola that starts in Shenzhen in the super headquarters campus in 2013 and ends up by a project that we have done with Tom Leather Landscape Architects jointly for the green infrastructure of this part of the city, and that we are now starting to develop. The project is obviously like many of these projects, covering very large infrastructure, transport infrastructure system, but also retail project, and is very much based on the idea of turning that green axis, that park, into a campus that will be able to bring together all the companies that are going to be locating themselves in that enclave, in the super headquarters, but not only bring the companies together, but also bring citizens, bring egrets and butterflies and trees and all kinds of climatic devices that will turn this into a sophisticated environment. And so it's a kind of three-dimensional campus. It's not a flat campus like the models that we were looking at in Harvard and Princeton and other places, but is obviously a campus where the ground deforms in order to give access to elevated walkways and underground systems. A very important part of the development of the design had to do with the creation of canopies that will shade the public spaces from the very strong sun in Shenzhen, both through natural canopies, trees, but also artificial canopies that we modeled again using CFD models in order to locate the masses of trees and the canopies, so that the wind flows that are already there and that are running north-south between the bay and the Shenzhen mountains are enhanced, while at the same time producing these shading canopies for the park that sometimes are natural, sometimes are artificial, and those that are artificial are also incorporating ventilators, fans that will renew the air when necessary. These are some of these examples of the sunken plazas that that we are proposing to build over when the park falls down into the retail facilities. This is the way in which these sunken plazas are going to be lighting and bringing the air and the vegetation down to the retail level, and alternating these artificial canopies with natural canopies. You can see there the fans that will potentially be activated. We are planning also to use the AC condensate of the underground infrastructure in order to produce a more sophisticated environment for the project. So this obviously one of the central pieces of this green infrastructure is the transport infrastructure underground, which we have designed with these funnels that also include a ventilator at the top, and that are supposed to be constantly ventilating the underground spaces, which, I mean, and they are combined obviously with a landscape project that is supposed to be using the trees as signage for the station, and to incorporate also literally some other technologies, digital technologies, onto this merging with nature, as Carlo was mentioning before. This is this internal greenhouse station that we have proposed, and this is very different from other greenhouse, other station atrium that we have built recently in Birmingham, also covered with ETFE, but obviously with an entirely different and much more, I think, interesting and exciting engagement with biomass, with vegetation, with greening, and that whose shape itself is going to operate as a kind of environmental regulator that ventilates this space. I would like to finish just with this image that our partners who have been also looking at the ecology proposed in the coastline of the park, which is what they call the egret lawn, but this is also a coastal auditorium covered with a retractable canopy, where egrets and other birds, but also other animals, butterflies and all sorts of birds that are present in this ecology will come to populate the city of the near future. I wanted to just, I mean, I know it's probably a little bit late, but perhaps it's worth kind of looking at some of the images that we, some videos that we have produced. You see there the ventilators, giga fans mounted on tensile shading canopies covering these natural spaces, going down to the retail facilities under the park. So the idea is that actually the architecture here is primarily a way of reshaping and improving the urban microclimate by using water, by using ventilation, by using plants being embedded into the urban infrastructure. These are images of this future station underground, and these panels extracting air from the underground. I don't know whether I think maybe we can stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alejandro, for this wonderful idea of reconnecting our cities to nature. And although we didn't quite hear what you said with the animation, but we did got the wonderful, enticing bird songs. We believe your words are as powerful as the bird songs. Thank you very much indeed. So we'll now move on to our third speakers, Amalie, Andreas, and Dan Wood. Amalie Andreas is the Dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture Planning and Preservation. Dan Wood was the 2017 Gehry Chair at the University of Toronto Daniels School of Architecture, as well as in 2013 and 2014 Louis Kahn Chair at the Yale School of Architecture, and is currently an adjunct associate professor at Columbia GSAPP. Amalie Andreas and Dan Wood are the founders of WorkArch, which was the #1 design firm in Architect Magazine's 2017 Architect 50 and the 2015 AIA NYS Firm of the Year. Ladies and gentlemen, Amalie and Dan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. We're very excited to be joining you from Rhode Island, actually, right now. And let me try to share my screen. I cannot share because, Alejandro, do you want to stop sharing or? So I think I would say it's really fascinating to see both Alejandro and Carlos' work, and I'm excited to see everybody else in that. I think we have approached similar themes of architecture and landscape and the relationship between architecture, urbanism, and the countryside or the rural, but from a maybe reasserting form and reasserting architecture as the main technology and kind of embracing a sort of more lower tech approach to that integration and kind of rediscovering sort of historical means of integration. So it's kind of fascinating to see this. So it really started with our book on visionary cities that was kind of reread through an ecological lens with the kind of manifesto that today's we may have technology, but maybe we have forgotten ideas about what makes a great city and where form can sort of come in to bring those ingredients together. And so the various themes of that integration are ideas such as in-food structure, using food as a form of infrastructure that really kind of reconnects the urban, the natural, and the rural. This was our Public Farm 1 made out of cardboard tubes at PS1 MoMA in 2008, and a kind of first creation of a system that brings all these things together, including creating new forms of public space and shared experience. That took us to the series of edible schoolyards, transforming public school parking lots into organic small farms for community, for children to learn how to grow food, cook, etc., and create a kind of new connection between architecture and landscape through food, through ideas about health and systems. And this is currently a sort of collaboration we're doing with Farm One, a sort of company in New York that's developing hydroponics and very high-end interior farming. And we're kind of proposing possibilities for cities around the US and elsewhere. Sorry, I don't know why it's froze. To kind of bring, oops, sorry, no, it's, I'm gonna skip that page. Proposing the idea of integrating kind of indoor farming, hydroponics, aeroponics, etc., and inserting it in different cities around the world. These ideas also continued with, sorry, clearly having an issue here with the PPT. Do you think it's the video, Dan?
No, I think it's these drawings.
Okay, I'm gonna.
past it.
Yeah, I'm going to go past. These ideas continued with our Beijing Horticultural Expo Master Plan, again, kind of taking the whole collaboration with the Juppé, taking kind of very large scale sort of urban setting and bringing the kind of intersecting the urban grid and the rural grid to create new kinds of shared experiences, but also a kind of integration between the urban, the rural, and the natural. This kind of collapse is something that we're looking at now in Lebanon, where we are exploring the question of density, and it's almost the collapse of greenscape, or the mountains and the sea sort of coming together through these series of villas, 60 villas that are kind of creating a topography that kind of trickles down to the sea. And the idea is that the section is incredibly compressed, creates both a very town-like experience, but at the same time allows everyone it's kind of a new intersection of the individual and the collective, with just a section that kind of allows you direct access to the views of the sea, but also in a kind of very, very compressed way as a means to preserve the rest of the coastline. And this idea of preservation is also something that we see as enabling a kind of more sustainable approach to cities. This is a project where we kind of only kept the facade and created new apartment units behind, but again, articulating the architecture and the space to create these sort of outdoor areas that are completely recessed, that bring outside in, and that enable, you know, additions on an existing structure without, while still preserving the kind of landmark form. And collaboration, in this case with Michael Hansmeyer, to reinvent the Corinthian capital for the 21st century. This was a kind of scripting of a capital that looks historical, but is actually completely new. And so these motifs of nature and architecture are also something that is interesting to us as well. Preservation is also about kind of inserting within existing typological typologies. So in this case, this is a insertion at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, where we took the back of the building to create a front and a sort of contemporary post office, let's say, where all of the Amazon deliveries for the students come in, to create a sort of new space for community, for encounter, and also a kind of highly flexible, transforming space for the students to come together. And this is really just kind of appropriating the parking lot. Students are called, you know, everywhere on campus to come pick up their package. The boxes are recycled because it's an art school. And so there's a kind of whole system that gets created. And we also were able to carve a performing kind of flexible space as well. We took the notion of Alejandro's envelope in a different direction. We were looking at thickened envelopes where we could reinstate space or public space. In this instance where we were given 4 feet to cover a parking lot in Miami, and declared that that was the space for architecture, and created this vertical public promenade with a library and a kind of art gallery and a series of experiences. And at night, and you know, the kind of architecture disintegrate because of its materiality, and you start to read and register the parking garage before. This idea kind of was pushed much further for our Beirut Art Museum, where we wanted to investigate the balcony as a device, as an old device that nevertheless was incredible in negotiating inside and outside, public and private, and sort of bringing a sort of an idea of vertical gardens into the sides of the buildings. And so this Inside Out Museum creates these outdoor galleries, rooms that are gardens, but also places for sculpture, places that negotiate inside and outside, and kind of bring art to Beirut, and sort of integrate art and the city life and greenery along the facade of the building, which is a sort of kind of celebration of openness for the city. A sense of creating environments, and but again with a slightly less, a more maybe whimsical approach to constructing nature, and that is more graphic, more two-dimensional, and more pop. In some ways, this was our store for anthropology, where we literally allowed vines to grow around circles to kind of really indicate the artificiality, but also the playfulness. And again, just through architecture, cutting holes, and in a very simple way to bring the outside in. Some of these kind of formal strategies were also explored in the Kew Gardens Hill Library, where a very simple, again, not so complex, almost like a flattening of the architecture allowed a certain compression to bring the green roof to the front and make it really part of the facade of the building. And then again, using architecture to kind of bring the outside in from the north as well as from the south. And then finally, the idea of systems, which we're very interested in, you know, a house as a living machine, or but kind of reinventing that for today, where a house is a greenhouse, is collecting water, is mitigating temperature, but again, much more through, I would say, HVAC, much more through sort of architecture, I guess. And this is a current house that we are designing, a guest house in Arizona, a sort of collapse, a very crude collapse of a sort of thickened space for the bedrooms that negotiate temperature, and then the greenhouse for the living area. Again, many of these ideas come together for the North Boulder Public Library, which we're currently also it's starting construction soon, which is a net zero building where the air is really circulating through chimneys. The chimneys are very much expressed in the architecture. We embrace the thickened envelope, again, in this project as well to negotiate. We integrate a greenhouse and sort of bring all these ideas together to create a building that is very architectural, but also echoes with the kind of surrounding mountains of Boulder. And then finally,
I think we were supposed to switch there somewhere.
oh,
but-
sorry, sorry. I'm very conscious of time.
This is an exhibition that we did in Bruges. Oh, okay, then you can't hear what I say. Oh, that's fine. I think it's hard to hear me over the music, judging from Alejandro's presentation, but if you hear me, it's an exhibition where we looked at our entire body of work through the lens of systems, and specifically water systems. So it goes from the scale of a sink to a shower, where we integrated plants into the shower so that the steam from the shower feeds the plants, to larger sinks, to some of the ideas about in-food structure, where water and plants combine to create food in the city, whether that's plants or fish in this case, in this aquaponic system that merges plants and fish in a kind of symbiotic relationship. To larger projects where the building itself is a kind of plumbing fixture that collects water and distributes it as a gray water system throughout, but also as a waterfall, or here in a proposal for the Guggenheim as a kind of water park, sliding down the ramps to experience the art. In this room, all projects where water is a challenge in the drought affected areas or deserts. And then looking at projects that are on the ocean that specifically have to do with the relationship between water and city at the moments where the two meet. And then a room about the future of cities and the future of the planet with larger projects, such as our proposal for a new city based on shared infrastructures called Nature City that was presented at MoMA in 2014, to a view of water mining asteroids on the moon.
That's it.
Yeah, we have an extra 2 minutes.
Thank you so much, Amalie. Thank you so much, Dan. It's simply great, brilliant to see this refreshing ideas regarding building as a living entity, from the entirety of cities to the envelope to the systems inside buildings. And it's so refreshing and so healing to see this during the time when COVID is still around us. Thank you very much indeed. Let's move on to the fourth speakers. Massimiliano Fuksas and Doriana Fuksas. Massimiliano Fuksas and Doriana Fuksas are Italian architects, obviously, and founders of Studio Fuksas. With offices in Rome, Paris, Shenzhen, and Dubai, over the past 40 years, Studio Fuksas has developed an innovative approach through a strikingly wide variety of projects, ranging from urban interventions to airports, from museums to cultural centers, and spaces for music, from convention centers to offices, from interiors to design collections. Ladies and gentlemen, Massimiliano and Doriana.
Thank you for inviting us to take part in this very impressive Biennale. It's a pity that we can be with you in this horrible moment that anyway gave us the opportunity to reflect as all the others. Maybe we had the chance to assist to a group of architects that have a very impressive observation on our world. And this take me back in the past, thing that I don't like to do, but listening to all of you speaking was impossible. Don't reflect, don't remember the Biennale, our Venice Biennale in 2000. What is the mission of an architect? It's not only the one to build what clients ask, what competition ask, whatever, but it's to pay attention, to have a deep reflection on our work. And so the first one I remember was Anzoline. The Biennale before the one we did was in '98, and so was the architect like a seismograph. And the topic was very interesting. When we did the other one 2 years later, yes, was less aesthetics, more ethics. So why I'm speaking about this? Because during the 2 years we were preparing this Biennale, we had the time, of course, to work less on projects, but more in reflection and in preparing this very huge work, because it was a really huge project. And so we show what we were doing all around the world, in the mega city, in the megalopoli. We represented this. Of course, every architect did a project, a special project for this Biennale. But the most impressive things was the spontaneous architecture, the spontaneous act that all of us did. And so it was a big wall all along the Corderie dell'Arsenale in Venice, was 400 meters long and 4 meters high. In this one were represented all the catastrophes we were doing, and so like wars, like immigration, like pollution, all the worst we could do. Those was 20 years ago, and the only thing that now I can say we didn't reflect on was the virus. Because we couldn't imagine that in 2020, in 2000 at the moment, we could be stopped, frozen, without moving anymore, without traveling, without meeting other people by a virus. But at the end, if I can think about the poster, was something that we called a magma, but was not a magma. If I can say, I could say today it was a virus, because maybe it was something that you could feel. I think that if you are sensible, if you are attentive, you can feel the things before happen and do something against. So we close with the Biennale, but because also it's a very, very old. But this was only to say that all the projects we do, we always try to remember that we work for the people, for human beings. And when you think that you have to live inside what you build, inside the spaces you create, it's important because you have to take care. Yeah, please go. This is in Beijing. It's a museum. It's under construction. It's a museum in CBD, in Central Beijing district. It's in front of a garden. Could we see the one before, please? The picture before, yeah. It's in front of a garden, and the idea was to integrate this even not big building with what he has in front, and so he is in a reflecting metal in the way that we you can reflect the garden, the trees, the water that is in front of this. It's in two parts, connected by ramps of staircase, red staircases. And you can go, please. Go ahead, because we go fasten. Okay. Go. You can just show, because it's important. You can see only the images is enough. Okay, this is the interiors, all the one before, please. This one is again China. I would like again to stay there. I love China. It's the country with the most energy possible in the moment. It's the youngest country. And could we see the airport, Shenzhen Airport, please, after this? Okay. This is a very important for us. This is a very important project, and because I was telling that China is important for us, and I love, because this is like the model we did for the competition. To build the airport, we took 26 months, and so we couldn't have even the time to come si dice, consumare, to consume the idea. It maintains the freshness of the idea, the freshness of the when we think about how to do the project. The same thing. It's only possible in China, I think. This every piece is done is different from the other. It's done by hand. Could we go? Yeah, please go. Again. It's the same, and the outside is the same than inside. Again. These are okay. Okay, stop the one before. Okay, those the sculptures that are inside are for conditioning. That one. We always used to work with artists and with light designers, with people that does other works, not alone, because we believe that it's very important to work to share ideas with other people. But this time was not possible to have an artist, and we did. We did the sculpture alone for conditioning. And here you can see the depressions that are inside the airport. That it's a landscape, in fact. Outside represents the landscape, the small mountains that are in Shenzhen, in that same place. We pass to another Chinese project that is Gosen Tower. Maybe you can continue.
This project is in Shenzhen. This is a tower, grosso modo 300 meters high. But the most important was that we start with this to something like it's a depression, but it is not a depression. It's only to use for three times the same air conditioning. We change this. In this gap, you have all the possibility to reutilize. Next one. Okay, you can see now. Of course, there is a garden on the top, there is a garden on the down. This is something that we are just finished to build. Thank you. Another one. Go on. It's very difficult to go on in this way, but anyway, we try. This is the gap in which we had the changing or the climb from inside to outside. Go on, please. This is in Paris. Archives in Paris. Go.
Next. Okay.
This is interesting because
Just
I get too much. Come back, please. This is the big sculpture inside. After the next. Oh, okay. In the middle, there is a big gap with the Gorby project. We asked Anthony Gorby to do this is in between the big block. The big block is archives that has to be completely closed and protected by air, sun, everything. And the other part with a lot of air, a lot of sun, a lot of light is all the place where people are walking. And the bridge connected this part with the big buildings with that. And go on, please. Again. Yeah, so you have like artists, and the sculpture is always the most important part in our work. Again. Next. This Tbilisi is for civic services. During the day and the night, this was, we did this for the government, the President of the Republic, former President of the Republic in Tbilisi. And this was 11 leaves that are quite kindly deposited on these buildings. Go on. Next. These are the leaves. This is the bridge that we did in the middle of the city. And all the building is not only outside that you can see a different emotion. You can see the emotion inside, that is, the leaves are really part of the building. Next. This is another, just in front, you can see, we have another project that is Art for Art and Music Center. All these projects are completed, we don't want to speak too much, are always sustainability, save energy, save water, circular system. This is, of course, it is a normal for us since 20, perhaps 30 years. I don't want to speak about what we are doing every day. Go on, please. Okay, next. And this is in New York. Doriana wants to speak about this because she loves a lot to work with Giorgio. Is one of the best friends of Doriana. Can you say something?
Yes, it's New York, Fifth Avenue.
Next.
Yeah, please. Okay. Also here the staircase is it's really important because it's a very deep space, very long, and so people couldn't go till the end of the shop. And to allow people to go inside and to circulate all inside the space, we did conjunction with the staircase. Very
no, because it's, sorry. Because there is a point that we have, of course, we have elevator, lift, everything else, but we try to use the staircase like a really pedestrian, like a walking space, architectural walking space. And this was our first, and the end of the project was this was quite good. Thank you again. Doriana.
Okay. Next, this is something. It's incredible because we did the construction of the staircase in Italy, in pieces and shipped in the States because it was impossible to realize with the same price and with the same time and the same quality in the States, and so it's done in Italy and mounted in New York. Please. Next. This is the Rome Convention Center that is in the Quarter dell'Euro, and that is very new, is one of the rationalist quarters in Rome, done in the 30s, and it's all in white travertino stone. And we did something that now the name of this is La Nuvola. And it's something that it's look, you can go on the next one, please. Okay, next. Okay, the black one is an hotel, and the white one, the glass one, the transparent glass one is the convention center. In this building, there is another one. It's the floating space, the floating cloud. In the interior of the cloud, there is an auditorium. Downstairs, there is another big auditorium. And it's something that Rome loves so much that they call La Nuvola. It's not the name. They call the cloud, because it's something that the town keep very soon. At the beginning, they decided that it was something that was always there. Maybe because it was the place in which Federico Fellini turned a movie in the same space that was empty from many, maybe from the beginning of 19th century. At the beginning there was a parking, and after this nothing else anymore. You can go, please. Please, next one. Next one.
Okay.
Next one. Can you change? Forse non sentono.
Non lo so.
I can't. Oh, please. Bene. Next one, please. Next.
Okay, questo è tutto.
Okay, finished. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimiliano and Doriana, and for showing us your human approach in the large-scale urban projects. Thank you very much indeed. We are now about 15 minutes behind our original schedule, so but we still have time for some questions. I do see that there are 3 questions already posted in the group chat in Zoom. We will ask the people who has asked the questions to ask the questions. Anna 160, are you there? Anna? Okay, and the organizer tells me that all the audience, they are automatically muted, so I need to read out the questions. So this is a question from Anna 160. She asks, is the question to Zaropolo. She asked, recently the Chengdu Green Towers became viral in the architecture media, which look exactly like your dystopian proposal about the greenery eaten the building. What can this case teach us about green infrastructure?
I actually replied already online to this question, and unfortunately I don't know these towers, so I cannot really comment on the Chengdu Towers. I mean, maybe I'm slightly disconnected. I mean, I know that there is a Chengdu Towers, but I don't see them covered in green or eaten by green. Can this tell us about infrastructure? I mean, the incorporation of green to buildings is something that many people have been working on. I mean, Stefano Boeri, for example, there's a number of people who have tried it and are actually doing it. It's almost like a no-brainer. It works. So I think everybody should be doing, because it has many advantages. But for me, the most interesting part of this little journey that I try to explain in the presentation was more about what are the aesthetic implications of getting buildings covered in green. And I mean that this is where I think that the ideas of the ruin or the buildings overgrown by green are most interesting, and I think they also emerge at a time where as I try to explain, we are moving to a city that where I think that the humans will slowly lose currency to other species, perhaps to other types of population, robots or birds or other animals, and I think that. In some ways, the little statement that I was trying to make is that there are opportunities where this engagement of architecture with nature can actually produce very deliberate effects that move them away from the more conventional images of green cities that we see produced the world over. I mean, even Trump is talking about planting trees, so it's incredible. For me, the question is, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for architects? What does it mean for design? How can we take advantage of this?
Thank you, Alejandro. I think I will prioritize questions with a specific panelist to ask the questions for our specific guests. And here is one for Amalie. Dear Amalie, I'm so excited to all the practices of public farm, and I'm wondering which will be more suitable for cities, decentralized urban farming or centralized urban farming in the future? Thanks.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think we can no longer afford either or conditions. I think in a way it has to be both. A number of years ago, MVRDV and us made a comparison in terms of how to feed Manhattan. And we looked at a kind of horizontal, taking over Newark, taking over a huge region around Manhattan to feed locally. And then MVRDV looked at stacking, almost doubling the city vertically to feed the city. And so, I think it can't be one or the other. In the age of COVID, one of the reasons why this firm we're working on, Farm One, is gaining momentum beyond the sort of very elite growing of certain herbs is that all of the kind of supply chain of food and are breaking down, and so people are realizing that it's going to become sort of almost economically viable to have food in cities, and whether it's taking over existing lots or especially as car automation comes in and etc. But at the same time, I don't think we can in any way assume that we'll be able to feed the planet by simply integrating farms with cities. I think you're going to continue to need large-scale farming. Ideally, we would move away from industrial farming towards more intensive sort of organic farming. But so it's really going to be bits and pieces and combinations. And for us as architects, what's exciting is how does that create new kinds of shared spaces and experiences and new kinds of typologies and a sense of community. Food really brings people together across ages and a kind of network of people. So.
But Brian, could I add a little bit?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Actually, the following two questions are to you, Carlo.
Oh, no, then I shouldn't. But I want to say, I think Amalie is totally right. I mean, actually, I wanted to add something more, physical. If you were to based on physics, if you were to look just at the amount of energy that falls on Manhattan, that amount is not enough for feeding. Somehow the food we eat is energy coming from the sun. We use, plants and animals to transform it into something that we can eat, and then we collect that energy. And in that process, there's a lot of inefficiencies, but that amount of energy is not enough to grow enough food to feed Manhattan. So the footprint of Manhattan is much bigger. Of course, you could actually do skyscrapers like I think Vinny proposed, where you do a lot of artificial lighting and you grow a lot of stuff. But if you do artificial lighting, and if you want to do it in a sustainable way, you take energy from the sun, then you turn it into power, electric power, and then you power LEDs, and then you grow with LEDs. And if you do that, you add two additional steps in the chain, which make it much less efficient. So in a nutshell, I just want to reinforce what Amalie was saying, that this is more about us connecting with something that's so important for us. It's part of our nature. We are part of nature, and connecting with the seasons and in things growing is very important to who we are. Is what my colleague at Harvard, E.O. Wilson, would call biophilia. It's part of our innate love for nature. But we shouldn't think that tomorrow we will just grow food next to home.
So until our bodies learn to photosynthesize, Carlo. And two questions to you, Carlo. And the first one actually has been asked by a number of from our audience, a number of people from our audience. The question is about, can you talk a little bit on Uber? And because as we know, under COVID, Uber is facing a pretty hard time. And not only they are now reserved to one person, which is one driver and one guest, but also there are now partitions separating the driver and the guest.
Totally.
What do you think?
Totally. Thanks for asking that. I would say I'll be very quick, but if you think about the impact of COVID, I think we certainly have an intermediate phase while we need to coexist and live with the virus, and that's where we are now. And certainly we need to social distance. But if you're thinking about our cities, we need to take the long view. We need to look at the long term. And if you look at the past, you see that cities have gone through many, many pandemics in the past, even more disruptive ones. Think about Venice. The beautiful city of Venice that was mentioned before, in the 14th century, loses 60%, 60 of its population because of the Black Death, because of the plague, because of the pandemic at the time. And despite that, in the following centuries, we kept on enjoying Venice, on crowding its theaters and narrow streets and living next to each other. So somehow I think, you're totally right. In the intermediate term, I guess it will, at one point this will stop. I don't know if it's going to be in 6, 12, 18 months or more. But then I think our cities will go back to how they've always been. And I think, as designers, we need to look at both dimensions. But if we think about the long term, if you think about the city overall in urban planning, that's really the long term, the long view. And so it's about looking at things that will stay after COVID is gone. By the way, just very quickly, this doesn't mean that, some things like social distancing will go back to what it was before, but many other things will not go back. And for instance, the way we organize our offices, the way we live from home, the way we commute, most likely those will be disrupted forever. But still, that's a long view, which is, I think, today, the most important one.
And the second question to you, Carlo, is about what the role digital technology can play in promoting citizens' participation in new urban public spaces.
Yeah, and that's another great point. In this hybridization of the natural and the artificial, again, I think what I found very beautiful about all the presentations is that somehow we are all struggling with the same question and looking at it from different angles. So I think, there's also something interesting here. Maybe, following the Biennale, the Beijing Biennale, we should come together more and try to share a lot of these different learnings we've accumulated by looking at this on different angles. But if you look at this, something we've been looking at more is about how digital can help us really breathe in a new life in the world of the artificial. And of course, one of the most poetic ways to do it is actually to use the digital to engage people more. It's about, the natural and the artificial through humans helping through more participation, helping to shape our cities and our buildings. So there's certainly a lot of potential there. I'll mention just a couple of projects. There's a project we are working on right now. It's still speculative with Dan Rosegaard, the Dutch artist, who's a great friend. That's about how we can do some kind of crowdsourcing in order to do a collective urban project where everybody will contribute digitally and physically a small piece, and those pieces will create a coherent whole in the end. Dan and I were inspired by a famous church in Naples where every stone in the church has the 2 letters of the people who sculpted actually that piece of stone, who carved that piece of stone. And so that's one example. And there's a few others. We've been working with an office in Boston called the New Urban Mechanics Office at the City of Boston, which, the idea of the New Urban Mechanics is to make people like mechanics of the city. And with them, we've been working with different ways to really have more participation thanks to digital networks in order, again, to blend human input with the artificial of the city in new ways.
Thank you, Carlo, for your answers, and our thanks to Wang Yu for asking these questions. The next question is to Fuxas. It's about Shenzhen Airport. It has been asked by an anonymous listener, and he or she is saying that as soon as the airport got constructed, it went viral on internet, and everyone was shocked by its modern shape and aesthetic value, and also the choice of material and the design of the ceiling in the interior. And this particular person says that he or she sees some kind of similarity between Le Corbusier's Brise Soleil construction and the Shenzhen Airport. So can you comment on the relationship between your work, which is the airport, and Le Corbusier's? Thank you. I've been told by the organizer that unfortunately Massimiliano and Doriana are offline now, probably due to some errors in connection, so they can't answer the question now. I guess no other guest can answer this question neither. So let's move on to the other questions. Another question to Amalie and Dan is also asked by Yu Wang. She says, I think the thick envelope concept is very interesting. It kind of blurred the boundary of public and private. What do you think of the future relation between the public and the private realm? And how will that change our public landscape?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking all these good questions. I think what in the future we can, as cities become denser and population increases, one thing that we think is that our notion of public space is very two-dimensional. I think, as Alejandro mentioned, also, we can't continue to simply occupy just the ground with public space. And I think we see these thickened envelope projects as a way of experimenting with a more vertical public space to duplicate or replicate over again that space of the ground up through the building, which is in a way related to Corbusier. So we can answer that with his—
And to Asian cities.
Yeah, and Asian cities in general, where this experimentation with verticality has been going on for some time. But particularly in the private realm, I think it'll be interesting to see how we can integrate truly public space, not just privatized public space, vertically in the cities of the future.
That would have to come through policy.
Thank you. Next question is from Jenny, is to Carlo. I like your idea of the creation of 4 seasons in one day. We want to create a natural feeling in our indoor space as well, such as using the technology to create a natural sunlight and using airflow to create a wind breeze. Can you talk a bit more of how to create blend nature into the building in different interesting ways?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for asking this. And you're right. Somehow we see many buildings. Try to. And I've shown you also some of our work that tries to just bring nature inside the building. But there's much more complexity to nature. And so I want to mention a couple of things. One is a study we've been doing for Rockefeller Center in New York, actually looking at using a special type of LEDs. They're called sun-like LEDs, and basically sun-like LEDs emit with the same spectrum of the sun. You know, one of the problems is that a lot of the LEDs we're using, a lot of the LEDs also used in electronics, in our computer screen, in our iPhone screens, and so on. They emit with different frequencies. The light is much more blue, so the spectrum is tilted one side, and that has been related to many of the issues we have today, including less melatonin and lack of sleep and so on. So somehow this is has been a speculative study about together with Rockefeller Center about how we can use sun-like LEDs and bring like real light from the sun underground in the Rockefeller Center. And the same thing, we have another project, is not public yet. We've been working on the new Vibram store. As you know, Vibram is one of the world's leading producers of soul. But they're very poetic in the way they do them. I think their motto for the company is a bit, your contact point to the planet. And there we've been working really about recreating different type of environment, mountainous environment in the store itself, with different granulometry of stone that goes from very, very small to very large. But also in that case about cleaning the air with electrostatic filters and reproducing the molecules that you find in the mountains. So basically it's mountain air that ends up in the center of Milan or New York. So what I want to say is that, yes, you're absolutely right. Somehow that's where technology becomes important in this, is certainly you can start by bringing nature inside the building, but then, nature comes together with a much richer network of interactions with, as you said, with lighting and the quality of air and the composition and the molecules and the ecosystem. And somehow it's a big endeavor of how you work across all these dimensions.
Thank you, Carlo. And I think we have less than 10 minutes left. So let's conclude with this very important question from David Blankel. It's about the emergency we are facing. It's a question to everyone. So may I kindly request that each of you answer the question within 1 minute. And the question is, I see most of the projects are focused on how to take advantage of natural resources more than usual, besides the news of the week of how many time we have to live before climate changes is inevitable. How do you think this will affect future architects or future graduates in the architectural field? Would it be something that will be the new context that we will have to work with? Try to solve habitability, trying to save our resources. So probably we can start with Amalie and Dan.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is already, climate change is already ground zero for everything that we do as architects. It's, we have to approach it through form and design. We have to approach it through technology, but we also, I think, increasingly have to approach it through politics and questions of environmental justice and all of these things that I think as architects we find ourselves often at the intersection of all these forces, and how we negotiate these forces is a little bit the burden and the responsibility that we have moving forward.
And I think just quickly, the environmental movement also is changing and is recognizing that, the nature did not survive its relationship with humans, and that we actually need to change the way we think about that relationship in order to ensure our mutual survival. And I think that this question of between artificial and nature, unfortunately, will become so much more important. Because nature just is not making it on its own. So,
thank you, Carlo.
Yeah, I think it was Buckminster Fuller, the great Buckminster Fuller, who said that architecture is in between utopia and oblivion. And I think if we don't engage with those issues, those crucial issues first, climate change, then this is going to be oblivion. But if we are able to engage with it, and I think what we should do is really put that at the core of our thinking. And I'm not 100% on in sync this time with Paola Antonelli. You might have seen Paola from Roma, but she did a beautiful, curated a beautiful exhibition at Milan Triennale last year, which was Broken Nature. And her starting point was somehow, there's not much more we can do. And so design should be something similar to palliative care. Well, I refuse to accept it. I refuse to accept that design should be palliative care. I think, the design should go back to, as we mentioned before, Herb Simon's definition, or looking at how the world could be. And then we got many, many tools at our disposal to really see how architecture, design, planning can help us still get out of this mess. And I think that means both looking at our cities. Cities are responsible for 75% of energy consumption, 80% of CO2 emissions, but also engaging architecture with big projects of geoengineering. Can we actually start looking at, so if things were to get out of control, can we find a last kind of a, can we find some geoengineering solutions that could help us, as an escape route? And so I think that should be really the focus of all of our efforts in the coming years.
Thank you. Zaropolo. Alejandro. Alejandro, you are muted. Thank you.
So, yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question, and it's obvious. I mean, in some ways, I go back to the statement with which I started the presentation, which was the statement of the Seoul Biennale. In the most critical questions that city need to answer in the near future do not have to do so much with community or identity or lifestyle. It has to do with the engagement with constituencies that are not human, that are nature, that are the earth, that are regimes of energy, and as Carlo just mentioned, this is a very low-lying fruit. So you can spend zillions of dollars investigating new kerosene fuel to reduce the carbon emissions of airplanes, but 70% of energy is consumed in buildings and cities. 48% of carbon emissions are consumed in buildings and cities. If we are able to do a minimal change to the way we practice, we may have an incredible impact on the world. And so, in that sense, I mean, I would like to say that architecture has gone through a kind of a retrograde phase recently, looking back at style, looking back at maybe the history of architecture, etc., etc. I think I would like to be a little bit more polemical and say that those attitudes are not going to go very far, and the proof of that is history itself. I mean, I think that we are now in a time not dissimilar to the one modernists lived, in which there was a huge defacing between the evolution of technologies and the evolution of architecture, and there is a well-known quarrel between modernist architects and the academicists, and so the modernists were engaging with hygienism, were engaging with new modes of industrial production, were engaging with a number of technologies that had grown on the side of architecture, and they tried to get involved with this, while other architects were actually looking. Architects like Tony Garnier. I mean, the question that I think we are facing is, do we want to be Tony Garnier or do we want to be Le Corbusier? I certainly want to be Le Corbusier. I don't want to be Tony Garnier. That's a kind of lesson.
Go ahead.
That's all. I think I That's what I wanted to say. That if we look back at history, looking back at the history of architecture is not going to get us anywhere. Is to look at actually the technologies that are surrounding architecture that are going to propel us to a truly effective and significant practice of architecture.
Thank you, Alejandro. I think we've had pretty intensive 1 hour and a half, and the things we've learned through the 1 hour and a half is truly precious. It's rightly this kind of great architectural thinking and optimism that keeps architecture, the profession, and the discipline great. So our deepest thanks to the speakers of our first half of this forum: Carlo, Alejandro, Amalie and Dan, Massimiliano and Doriano. Unfortunately, we are out of time at the moment, and we can't do a physical round of applause to show our appreciation, but I believe everyone is showing their gratitude in their own place, and our sense of gratefulness is true and genuine. Thank you so much to the speakers. The first half of this forum is now concluded. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you all. See you soon in person.
Thank you. Yes, let's meet soon.
Thank you, Alejandro. Goodbye.
políticas, 大国的首都，同时呢，它的这个世界上的影响力、政治、经济、文化的地位，同时呢，它也有这个近现代高速发展，现在进入高质量发展的阶段。
也就是说，北京这座城市啊，它具有自己相当鲜明的中国美学风格，尤其突出的体现为雄强、自豪这些非常博大的一种美学的情怀又有非常厚实的文化含量。
There's really the dynamism of growth and in optimism and a kind of risk-taking, adventurism, entrepreneurship, and the idea of great projects.
And we're now looking at a city that's 3,000-year-old history that was the largest city in the world during the Renaissance. They've become documents of their connection to a global world.
There's no country without population that will bear the responsibility of growth and urbanization.
I think Beijing is a very vibrant city with an amazing artistic scene.
北京の面白さはグリッドなんだけど多様性があって、一つのそのマス目の中にはもう他と全然違う別世界がある。
It's much energetic, and when you are in China, you can really feel the energy that comes. It's a very young nation. A lot of people young with that were strong in 20. You don't see all those old people that don't want to leave their places.
它肯定不是最好看的，它也不是最取悦你的，但是好像待一段时间之后，你还觉得它挺有意思的。你换个地儿，你还不习惯。
城市其实是承载人的生活的一个地方。如果这个生活是一个活泼的、开朗的、健康的这种城市的话，那它应该是充满了生活的乐趣。
对我来说，一个不断的变化的城市是充满乐趣的。
它为什么美？我觉得是因为它有一种冲突，所有这些两极之间的张力特别有趣，特别吸引人，也提供了好多可能性。
Cierto modo, a mí me hubiera gustado encontrar un Beijing
en el que lo que uno piensa que una cultura tan poderosa como la China o la de Oriente Lejano hubiera sido capaz de configurar la ciudad.
Visto que fuera nuestra experiencia china, si fuera un cuerpo, Beijing sería el corazón. El corazón, la ciudad prohibida, el eje, es el corazón histórico como este sol, el corazón cultural, el corazón de la memoria de lo que fue China, que de alguna manera se ha perdido y pensamos que tiene que recuperarse también.
有很多这个需要探讨的话题，无论是对旧城的保护，还是对这个未来的探索，可能都是值得社会去关注。
It's constantly changing, and like other Chinese cities, the scale of Chinese urbanization is very hard to comprehend, I think.
国家がすごく大きくて、で昔からの大きなスケール感の街がで、それがいまだにこう街の雰囲気をしっかり支えている。道幅も広くてなかなかこう歩いて渡るだけでも大変なような印象があるし。
By looking over the city, you are outside the city. You are not in the streets of the city.
What is there, what remains of the little city, is what I enjoy most when I go and visit Beijing.
Kind of how easily people talk in the street with each other, how seemingly almost familiar they are with each other, how little distance there is.
I find the old parts inspire me a lot, and but I never realized I could love grey. The courtyard houses themselves taught me about making a heart to a place.
它本身它就是动态，那么我们有什么依据去抓住一个静态的东西，就让历史定格在那里头。
人们要发展，要生活，所以它要不断的变化，所以它既是一个古都，呈现出历史的叠加的厚重，又是一个充满活力的现代的城市。
成百万上千万的居民服务的城市，但是更多的还要为这些老百姓服务。
You know, if you're really interested in history and in the future together, you can kind of basically make all those moments coexist.
And to say how to make a city on the edge of such a kind of vast territory of mountains, that is on the foot of the mountains, that feeling could be what would that mean? Could we enlarge the fresh air from there? Can we make more forestry that's connected to that? Can we use it to introduce that landscape with perspectives, with views, with building around the views, etc.
I think if you have a biennale that does not allow architects to show off, you lose the plot because it's a show. It's like having a circus with no elephants, you know. It might be humane, but it's going to be a boring circus. I think you have to take advantage of the ambition of individuals to show their stuff off.
未来发展，我希望还是能够在首都这么一个疏朗大气、服务好中央的这么一个大的背景之下，形成一个能够具有多样化，能够在世界的这个文化、世界的多样化的发展里面有一席之地的这么一个城市。
You have to get rid of the corporate superstructure and bring in what should be involved in a social state like China, a cultural idea.
这是一个大格局的调整，使我们过去这个近100年来北京的格局出现了变化所以我也觉得这个是一个挺值得期待的未来。
北京最大的特点是骨子里的包容。
La ciudad de Pekín, tiene sus fines, es una ciudad capital, es una ciudad administrativa, es una ciudad centro, es un centro político, de hecho, más que las razones de la existencia de Pekín son más políticas que incluso que económicas.
大国的首都，同时呢，它的这个世界上的影响力、政治、经济、文化的地位，同时呢，它也有这个 近现代高速发展，现在进入高质量发展的阶段。
也就是说，北京这座城市啊，它具有自己相当鲜明的中国美学风格，尤其突出的体现为雄强、自豪这些非常博大的一种美学的情怀，又有非常厚实的文化含量。
There's really the dynamism of growth and an optimism and a kind of risk-taking, adventurism, entrepreneurship, and the idea of great projects.
And we're now looking at a city that's a 3,000-year-old history that was the largest city in the world during the Renaissance. They've become documents of their connection to a global world.
There's no country without population that will bear the responsibility of growth and urbanization.
I think Beijing is a very vibrant city with an amazing artistic scene.
北京の面白さはユニークなんだけど多様性があって、一つのそのマス目の中にはもう他と全然違う別世界がある。
It's much energetic, and when you are in China, you can really feel the energy that comes. It's a young, it's very young nation. A lot of people young with that works from 20. You don't see all those old people that don't want to leave their places.
它肯定不是最好看的，它也不是最取悦你的，但是好像待一段时间之后，你还觉得它挺有意思。你换个地儿，你还不习惯。城市其实是承载人的生活的一个地方。如果这个生活是一个活泼的、开朗的、健康的这种城市的话，那它应该是充满了生活的乐趣。
对我来说，一个不断的变化的城市是充满乐趣的。
它为什么美？我觉得是因为它有一种冲突，所有这些两极之间的张力特别有趣，特别吸引人，也提供了好多可能性。
cierto modo, a mí me hubiera gustado encontrar un Beijing en el que lo que uno piensa que una cultura tan poderosa como la China o la de Oriente Lejano hubiera sido capaz de configurar la ciudad.
Visto que fuera nuestra experiencia china, si fuera un cuerpo, Beijing sería el corazón. El corazón, la ciudad prohibida, el eje, es el corazón histórico como este sol, el corazón cultural, el corazón de la memoria de lo que fue China, que de alguna manera se ha perdido y pensamos que tiene que recuperarse también.
有很多这个需要探讨的话题，无论是对旧城的保护，还是对这个未来的探索，可能都是值得社会去关注。
It's constantly changing, and like other Chinese cities, the scale of Chinese urbanization is very hard to comprehend.
骨格がすごく大きくて、で昔からの大きなスケール感の街ですね。でそれがいまだにこう街の雰囲気をしっかり支えているかな。道幅も広くてなかなか歩いて渡るだけでも大変な印象がある。
By looking over the city, you are outside the city. You're not in the streets of the city.
What is there, what remains of the old city, this is what I enjoy most when I go and visit Beijing.
Kind of how easily people talk in the street with each other, how seemingly almost familiar they are with each other, how little distance there is.
I find the old parts inspire me a lot, and but I never realized I could love grey. The courtyard houses themselves taught me about making a heart to a place.
它本身它就是动态，那么我们有什么依据去抓住一个静态的东西，就让历史定格在那个地方。
人们要发展，要生活，所以它要不断的变化，所以它既是一个古都，呈现出历史的叠加的厚重，又是一个充满活力的现代的城市。
成百万上千万的居民服务的城市，但是更多的还要为这些这个老百姓服务。
If you're really interested in history and in the future together, you can kind of basically make all those moments coexist.
Let's say how to make a city on the edge of such a kind of vast territory of mountains. That is on the foot of the mountains. That feeling could be. What would that mean? Could we do? Could we enlarge the fresh air from there? Can we make more forestry that's connected to that? Can we make use it to introduce that landscape with perspectives, with views, with building around the views, etc.
I think if you have a biennale that does not allow architects to show off, you lose the plot because it's a show. It's like having a circus with no elephants, you know. It might be humane, but it's going to be a boring circus. I think you have to take advantage of the ambition of individuals to show their stuff.
Hello, Alejandro. How are you?
Very well. How are you?
It's so great to have you. And hello, Raul. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you.
Thank you. Pascal, how are you?
Hello. Hello. I'm doing fine.
Thank you. And Winnie, are you here? We will wait for Winnie Mats to get online. Hello, Winnie.
Hi. I'm very sorry. Yeah, no, there was some technical issues with, so happy to be there.
Don't worry, it happens.
Nice to see you all. Good with it. That's really good. Wow.
So, all our guests for the second half now are in this meeting room. We are now in the second half of the International Forum of the Beijing Urban and Architecture Biennale 2020 pilot exhibition. The forum is sponsored by the Beijing Design Institute of Architectural Design and assisted by a special team from Global Knowledge Leifeng. I'm Zhang Li, Dean of the School of Architecture in Tsinghua University. On behalf of the curatorial team of the Beijing Urban and Architecture Biennale, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to all the distinguished guests and to the audience. It is simply great to have some of the biggest name in our contemporary architecture here tonight to talk about the future of architecture. The theme of this Beijing Urban and Architecture Biennale is positioning future, city, architecture, art, and technology. With these words as the starting point, the speakers will share their projections of future and have a discussion together. During the speeches, the audience can write down their questions in the Q&A session, and then it will be played out during the Q&A session after all the speeches. So we do expect some really inspiring conversations to take place. And what we have learned from the first half is that this can be longer than expected. I'm very sorry for keeping all these distinguished speakers waiting for over 10 minutes. Some has already waited for 20 minutes. Our apologies for that. So let's move on to the first speaker of this second half, Pascal Flammer. Pascal Flammer is a Swiss architect and founder of Pascal Flammer Architect. He has taught at the Accademia di Architettura de Mondriso, at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam, at ETH in Zurich, and at Princeton University School of Architecture. Currently, he is a guest professor at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. Ladies and gentlemen, Pascal Flammer.
So hello, thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me? I guess you can, right?
Yes, we do, loud and clear.
Good. Well, thank you for the invitation. And I have to say, I was very impressed of the first part. I had the glimpse. I saw the first part of the kind of the power and the rigorosity of how to fight basically climate change issues. I realized, I mean, there were mainly, let's say, like two ways, the idea of integration of nature, and also the idea of lowering the energy consumption to run buildings. And I think a third part that we could introduce also into discussion is the idea of reusing of existing materials, so that basically we could reuse materials in order to not to use less energy to make those new materials. We are currently working on a big housing project here in Switzerland based on this idea. Unfortunately, we're still in a lot of problems, also mainly legal problems on how to deal with question of guarantees of specific products. So I won't enter onto that, but actually just show you some older projects of my office that are more concerning actually about the perception of nature. Good. Sorry. Can you see my screen? So the first project is about actually as I said, the perception of nature. So understanding a building like a tool, or like a camera, or like a means that can actually perceive the outside in different ways. It's this little house in Boulder. It consists of 3 floors, and each floor is a different way to see to see outside.
Excuse me, Pascal. We are seeing a blank white screen. Is
really?
It right? Yeah.
Oh, that's bad. Did you see a picture before?
No. It
No.
starts with this white screen.
Wait, how do I do this? Does it work now?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this building that consists of 3 floors. On the ground floor, which is this one, is a floor of 220 centimeters height. It's completely glazed. It has no, I mean, it has an empty center. So it's actually a space where we're just part of the total surrounding. And as a counter movement to feel less exposed in this ground floor is a bit sunken into the earth, which produces a balance of being very much exposed and at the same time also protected in a very principled way. The upper floor is an idea where the nature is in a certain way is your opposite. So the center is the person standing in a space and looking at nature like looking onto a picture, basically, like in a museum watching at a painting. And the third space is a space below Earth, where you actually have no relation at all to the physical surrounding. I will make a short guide through the house. So that's how it's embedded in the greenery. And this is how it looks inside. So basically there is this glass all over, and important also in the back. I mean, you are never protected in this building. Show you some images. And then in the upper floor, which is in the section up here, we have a plan that is almost like organized like in a military way, a very strategic, simply cut of the plan into 4 equal pieces. And here, that perception of the outside is, as I said before, is a vis-a-vis, is kind of it's like a painting. And you walk from one space to the other around or along the glass. Like this. And then in the third space is the space below ground, where actually the surrounding is only a memory, is only memory. It's not present at all anymore. So it looks outside. Good. The next building I would like to show you is about the very small and about the very large. And it filters out the middle scale. It's a building where you cannot perceive the building as objects anymore. And there is another topic, which is kind of the idea to take away indication of time. So all details in buildings that indicate time have been removed. As a consequence, it is built in an insulation concrete, where insulation and concrete is in the same material, which produces kind of floor plans without any layerings or indications of details. And in section, as you see here, the building is on a slope. You either perceive the sky and the sea, Or since it's on the slope, you're so close to the building that you actually only perceive the very proximity of the building. So almost like the handcraft, the way it's done. Also, the way the building is done actually is kind of almost like in a Roman method. It means there are no strong coffrage to hold the concrete. So it will have a very expressive traces of how the building has been done. You approach the building through the roof and go down these little stairs, enter a little garden, and from here on come to a main space that itself is divided into two spaces, which is one a spring room with 4 central windows, and another room which is the summer room that has no windows. The bedroom is hidden by the fact that the stairs starts 5 steps earlier, and you cannot see actually any connection downstairs to the sleeping room. This is the sections, facade. And this is a model of how it will look. And what I like about this is that it kind of doesn't give any indication of, time when this has been built. And that is how the building looks. The next project I would like to show you is this house in Scotland, a house on an island. And the interesting part of here is that on this island, there are no trees. It only has rocks and water. And this entire building is on these two topics, on rock and water itself. And there are like 2 main spaces. The one space is the space on rocks, which is accentuated by this one wall that produces the rock wall. And the other space is the sea space, which is kind of a very abstract space that faces the abstract of an infinite sea. This is how this floor plan looks, and how this building looks. A next project I would like to show you is actually a student project that I made. It's a building it's a 3 floors building, all out of concrete, 3 floors above ground, stairs in the middle, 2 stairs actually placed on top of each other, and it produces the following spaces. On ground floor, the pillars are in the middle, which produces like a 60 times 60, 50 times 50 by Mies, a very open connection to the outside. And that's also the place you can take up the stairs here or here and enter this first upper floor where the pillars are on the corner, producing a very defined space. If you take the stairs to the very top, you will end up in this kind of floor plan where again, the perception of space is defined by a wall and a very clear direction. If you place all 3 floor plans on top of each other, you realize that they're like 3 very different ways to perceive space. And structurally, I find it's interesting that this space and structure is very much correlated. So structurally, we have the core, we have 4 cantilevers. These cantilevers hold this roof plate. And in order that it doesn't bend through, it's fatter in the middle. The lower plate is held up by this cantilever and the other one. In order that it doesn't bend through, it's actually pulled up by a traction cable. And the plates in the corners, in order that they don't fall down, they are pulled up by a cable. And the only pillars that are really actually on compression are the pillars in the middle. This produces a building that is, on one hand, a very simple building. At the same time, I think it produces a various of misleading of the reading of the building. I mean, it could look like almost like a Greek tripartition building. It could also look like a maison domino with the pillars and plates, but it ends up kind of being none of them. The last project I would want to show you is a rethinking of how to use steel in social or in housing, and some thoughts on working and living at the same place. When I look at, for example, this house Osama, I think it's interesting that it's not clear anymore if this guy works here or lives here. It's kind of a hybrid condition. Same with Francis Bacon's atelier. It's clearly on the top of a housing, but he uses it for working. Also, Louise Bourgeois' offices or houses have a kind of this identity between living and office. Or similar happens in this kitchen or in this bedroom. Of course, in Le Corbusier's work, this hybrid was also a constantly topic. And even if we go back to our older times, the idea of sleeping in the main kitchen was very common. In this project, there are several new typologies to bring people together in a new way. And there are two strategies. One is to make very small apartments in order to produce very specific spaces. And the other concept is to make very like apartments too big in order to produce very generic spaces. That produces working living apartments, the new typologies on old people to live close also in that house, collaborative housing, and also very small apartments that are like 4 square meters. Another basic change is the idea that usually our sleeping rooms are on the facade, or on the periphery. In this project, they come to the core, whereas what is usually in the core, the bathrooms, go to the periphery. This produces on ground floor this kind of empty spaces that can be working or living. And here in the upper floor, this floor plan where the bedrooms are minimized and placed at the center, which produces the possibility, these are the bedrooms, you know, to open and close these shaders and make it one large room, or close them down and use them as bedrooms. This is the typology for elderly people. It's the idea that they have themselves, each one has its own bedroom, but actually they can close their doors and suddenly start to have a larger communal space. That building also has a very large communal area. Then we have apartments with 6 bedrooms on 45 square meters, basically simply by reducing the bedrooms to just the beds, and then use the community to have a bit of a bigger communal space, or to produce like very small apartments. That is a construction section, again, with the idea to kind of use the in-between climate as the meeting rooms. And it's built out of steel, which is according at least to Swiss regulation on engineering, but also on fire issues and sound issues. It has this kind of slabs every 7 meters, and that is the construction detail of that building. It has this metallic walls that have a fatness of 2 centimeters that can be placed very efficiently on top of each other, and then simply this wood or this floor pieces can be hanged in. It looks like a building out of paper, and it will more or less look like that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal, for this brilliant presentation. It reminds us that future might not be a break, but a continuation of the poetics and anthropomorphism that has made architecture so great. Thank you very much indeed. And our next speaker is Raul Marotra. Raul Marotra is an architect, urbanist, and educator who is the founder principal of the Mumbai and Boston-based RMA Architects, and is currently the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Ladies and gentlemen, Raul Marotra. Raul, I think you are muted. You need to turn on your...
And you can see my screen. You can see my screen now? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Amalie. And thank you for this invitation. Wonderful to be part of this conversation. I'm going to sort of share with you really a provocation. I'm not going to show architectural projects, but in a sense, perhaps it might provide an armature of questions that I think what Pascal ended with is very much the kinds of answers I think my provocation might suggest, perhaps. And so I'm kind of picking up on this issue of flux. And I think the notion of flux, which is movement of people and change, and I kind of encompass in this what I would call slow flux and very quick flux. And so therefore one can look on this temporal scale at even climate change as slow flux. And, you know, there's demographic shifts, etc., which happen on account of climate change or on account of conflict, which are sort of in between. And of course, very quick flux is natural disasters. And I think this is something that's going to sort of have to characterize our imagination of what the urban might be. And this movement of people has been historic. The extent of it sort of increases with time. Sometimes it is in a context of conflict or resistance. Sometimes it's sort of with much more porosity. And so I'm going to just pick up on some of my research in India and share that with you. And the question, again, in the context of flux, what really is even the urban when we talk about India? And India becomes relevant just because of the scale. It is beginning to position for us in our discussions as a profession an extreme condition, because it's 1.2 billion people in limited land. And what does this mean? So the urban in India is defined by 3 criteria, which is a population, a town that has a population of over 5,000 people is urban. It must have a density of 400 people per square kilometer, and it must require 75% of the male population to be in non-agricultural employment. Now, this is really ridiculous, but of course there's a history to this in terms of the way the census was structured and the politics behind it, which I don't want to go into. But unless these 3 criteria are met, a settlement is not deemed to be urban, which means it doesn't get the support in terms of infrastructure, etc., patronage, even governance systems. And if you use these 3 criteria, India has about 7,523 towns that are deemed to be urban, that have a municipality, that even have amenities in terms of social infrastructure. But if I start unpacking and deconstructing the criteria and looking at it through each of those single lenses, it actually gives me a completely different reading. So if I took the criteria 1, which is a minimum population of 5,000 people, this is what India looks like. It's 47% India urban in 2011, and it's something like 32,000 settlements that are over 5,000 people. Some of them even go up to 100,000 people, but because they don't meet the 3 criteria, they're not deemed as towns. And so we are sitting on an urban time bomb, because there's something like 23,000 places that are between 5,000 people and 120,000 people that are treated like villages, which means they don't have the amenities, and therefore the implication on public health and a whole gamut of issues is enormous. Now, if I take criteria 2, which is a minimum density of 400 people per square kilometer, then Kashmir to Calcutta, 200 miles wide, is the world's biggest megacity. I mean, the density of Greater Houston is 240 people per square kilometer. So this is consistently over 400 people per square kilometer. So it's quite mind-boggling where you see the concentration of what might be urban places. And if I take the 3rd criteria, which is 75% of the male working population in non-agricultural labor, actually very little of India is urban, because most people are doing both things and they're moving. And so this is what I mean by flux, which is really actually a safe approximation would be that about over 200 million people are going back and forth between what are called urban places and the hinterland on a seasonal cycle. And the real proof of this was that when the pandemic hit, in 2 weeks, 30 million people had a reverse migration, and that was just 2 weeks. So that was a very good barometer on the extent of actually this flux that sort of exists. And so you see how you get 2 diametrically opposite readings of what is the urban, depending on the criteria that is used. Now, of course, our research is looking at rice growing areas, looking at the rail network, trying to predict where people are moving from, where this pulse and flux exists. Look at the wheat growing areas and seasons. It's a completely different sort of movement. And anyway, there are many criteria one is looking at, but basically, I think it's more convincing than ever that this flux is enormous, and it has a massive implication not only on how our urban imaginations need to be kind of articulated or reimagined, but of course it has an enormous impact on even architectural imaginations, housing typologies, etc. And that's where, for me, what Pascal ended with was stunningly interesting in ways these new imaginations can be permeated. So what does this sort of result in? It results in really us as a profession very comfortably organizing the world around us in these binaries, because they become actually easy to propagate in a sense, and it starts beginning to create a whole lot of these sort of polarities. And when this flux hits the ground, what really happens is what we see in most Indian cities, this kind of disparity, this sort of disjuncture between meaning and form. So, you know, people living in what you're looking at as the favelas are often employed in the formal sector, but they live in what is the informal city. And you see people in those high-rise buildings, including the world's biggest house there, who often are engaged in very informal economies, but they live in the formal city. So actually meaning, form, meaning, and these binaries that we organize the kind of condition around actually completely blur. They are not consistent, and therefore I believe they're not productive. I call this the kinetic city. And I kind of, my kind of reading is that this is characterized by the notion of elasticity, by incrementalism, which is very critical to economy in terms of how one invests, the logic of investment, the logic of postponement, the logic of transitional thinking in terms of design and planning, the notion of appropriation, deappropriation, reappropriation, which is linked to flexibility. I separate elasticity from flexibility, and the notion of soft thresholds. And by that, I mean the ability of porosity between income groups, the coexistence, etc. And we know that that affinity and rejection relationship between, say, favelas and the rich they service. And so these soft thresholds actually intrinsically exist, and I think must be kind of recognized. And for me, this diagram, I call it the 5 stages of squatting, which is these incremental moves by which somebody even establishes themselves in the city, and over maybe an annual cycle, it becomes the logic by which the city is made. And the appropriation, reappropriation, deappropriation of space, a regular street in Mumbai, 10 days for a festival, it gets appropriated with a community hall. At the end of the festival, it disappears and the street recedes back to anonymity. Or the way these great maidans or open spaces in Mumbai are used. This is cricket, and as I call it, this wonderful Indian game that was invented by the British. And these are sacred spaces in the city. And in the evenings, weddings wrap around it. And you see the cricket pitch no one touches, because that is really the sacred spot. The wedding appears from 7 o'clock in the evening to midnight or later, and disappears in the morning for the game of cricket. Now here, architecture is not even the spectacle of the city, but I think the static and the kinetic city, in a sense, coexist in synergy. You know, this festival mobilizes 5 million people on an annual basis. And when the 300 such large idols are immersed in the sea, the memory of the city dissolves. It melts away in the water because these are clay idols. So there's no method to encode the memory of the city here. It's an enacted process. And so this is quite opposite from the notion of architecture as the central spectacle of the city. And I was fascinated by Alejandro Zerapalo's presentation, where he talked about the skin and how little actually architects have to do with it. This I call the landscape of impatient capital, because capital is the only thing that sort of drives this so compulsively. Architects get reduced to form givers. Vendors take over the decisions in terms of the technology, which we are way behind on, honestly, correct? And so what does this mean in terms of coexistence, where even the smallest actors can coexist with the most powerful players, I think becomes an important provocation. This I borrow from my colleague Jean Busquets, where what has happened is really from the traditional city where you had urbanization, plot division, and buildings, to the garden city where urbanization and plot division actually collapsed and building was separate. Housing estates that are developer driven today, actually all these collapse because the urbanization process, the plot division, and the building is delivered as one. But today what we are seeing in most parts of the world is the opposite. Buildings happen first, plot division, which is regularization of urbanization, and then urbanization through the deployment of infrastructure. It's a complete flipping of the process. And so what does it mean? And so I think it challenges the idea of the city as a static and stable entity. If you, for a minute, believe in flux being something that we need to pay attention to. And you know, therefore, what do the precedents become? You know, the precedents then can't be what we see broadly speaking in the global north. We can't see precedents where architecture is the single spectacle of the city, where architecture is the instrument by which you organize the city. And this led us to study the Kumbh Mela, which was called Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity. This is the largest gathering of human beings on the planet. 7 million people live here at the city for 55 days, and 120 million people visit it on 5 sacred days. It happens at the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna, and when the waters recede on the sand bank, a very light city is produced to house 7 million people. And it is ephemeral, and it is a mega city because it's over 7 million people. And these are two images I took in October on the top when the water is yet there. And as soon as the water recedes, they have 8 weeks to deploy a city for 7 million people. It's a city that's built using the logic of a grid for its deployment. Every street on the city goes across the river. So it is a bridge for every street, therefore for every neighborhood, which means it's incredibly robust because the river can move, but the city's integrity stays. It replicates all the infrastructure of a regular city in terms of social as well as physical infrastructure, manpower, 10,500 sweepers. I always say this was the cleanest Indian city I've ever lived in. It has administration. It is, in comparison to Manhattan, quite sort of comparable. And that's what would happen if Manhattan had a bridge with every street going across. You'd have a completely different deployment of density as well as connectivity and mobility, but also the imagination of movement of human beings in space. And of course, I'm going to share with you two things very quickly. This is a lecture in itself. One is that the entire city is built out of 5 building materials. It's a kit of parts. That is everything above the ground. And so deployable, constructible, deconstructible. And so it is actually the logic which is replicable. It's not about being unique in terms, it's a very simple logic, but it produces very unique forms in terms of scale, just using those 5 materials. And that red stick that you see is 8-foot tall bamboo, which is the basic module, which ramps up into large temples, into large megastructures, into community halls, which are then clad with fabric, which produce all sorts of spectacular architecture. The second thing I want to kind of touch upon is the governance system, because I think, here the point I'm making is, what are the precedents we could look at if we want to deal with flux? And I think, so I've taken the architectural components as one, and the other is governance, which is more abstract. We call it policy, we call it, other forms of instrumentalizing governance. But here, this is a drawing which shows all the governance things that kind of happen. But what's most important is governance here is on a temporal scale, which means the power structure changes over the year when they plan for the city. Most of our cities today, actually our governance systems are more archaic than our buildings, and we don't recognize this. And that's the reason we are not prepared for flux, because for flux, we would need a completely different imagination, even in terms of the governance structure. And so here, it starts at the beginning of the year with the chief minister and the top politicians. It moves to the bureaucrats who become in charge. The politicians, only one person is reported to. During implementation, the whole hierarchy shifts to the bottom of the circle. And during the days of the festival, this man who is the commissioner can go outside the circle to get subcontractors. And so by the end of it, he is the man who is in charge, is reporting only to 1 or 2 people. So it's very nimble, it's not bureaucratic. And at the end of the festival, when they offer gratefulness to the Mother Ganges, within a week, the city disappears, leaving only these mats. And then in June, the monsoon arrives and every memory of the city is removed. And it is, just an imagination. It's ephemeral. But it is formal, it's intentional, and it's deliberate. Because when we see, we have to also detach the images of the informal from what's formal. So if I showed you images of the city, you would say, oh, this is an informal city. It looks like an informal city because it's temporary materials. But I would confidently say this, that in the context of India, besides Chandigarh perhaps, and maybe 10 other cities like Jaipur and others, this is perhaps the most incredible example of a formal, intentional, and deliberate deployment of resources to make an urban system. And that's what's remarkable about it. Now, is this a one-off? At the behest of my friend here on the screen, Alejandro Aravena, we expanded this for his Biennale, where we asked the question in the center of the Biennale, does permanence matter? And that was a provocation for architects because, is ephemeral a serious category to look at? And so for the Biennale, what we did was we expanded this categorization, and we also created a whole taxonomy of looking at ephemeral for transaction, refuge, religion, etc. Now, I just sort of want to end with how one is extending this. I'm sort of currently working on the question of sanity and equity through sanitation infrastructure. And this is a very interesting map we made. We took 10 diseases. I mean, here you're seeing 5. We took cholera, water shortage, we took child nutrition, we took malaria, etc., and we mapped it. And it was all very clear where this was occurring. And what you really have is what we call the global north is actually a minority world. It controls 73% of the world's economy, but only has 14% of the world's population. And where all of this happens, we have 86% of the world's population, and we have only 27% of the world's economy. So this is a massive imbalance, and it's an imbalance where the most important metric is human beings. So that's why the global north, south, developing world, etc., is problematic today. It is really the metric of the human being that will become central to our discussion and what our responses and imagination will be as architects. And this is a map that inspired this map, which Dutch architects made for the Rotterdam Biennale. And what's interesting is all the contested borders, whether it's the Mexico wall that Trump wants to build, or it's the Australian border, the borders that you see between Korea, North and South, and China and Japan. These are all the most contested borders that map exactly on this division between the minority and the majority world. And so it's a world that was coined by Shahid Alam, who is a photographer in Bangladesh. He did it for a photography biennale, but it actually is it's a word we should take more seriously because I believe developing third world, which imply the linear process, are redundant. And so I think really my provocation is that we need to design transitions, not look at absolute solutions. Architecture gets invariably co-opted in this disastrous condition of making absolute solutions. And so therefore, are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems? And that would be my provocation for this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raul, for this wonderful presentation. I think this provocative idea of ephemeral city would, of course, cause a huge resonance in our listeners' minds. And also, you have taught us that actually our cities built by people find a way, no matter what. Thank you so much. Thank you so much indeed. Our next speaker is Alejandro Aravena. Alejandro Aravena is a Chilean architect and executive director of the firm Elemental, a do tank focusing on projects of public interest and social impact, including housing, public space, infrastructure, and transportation. Alejandro Aravena is the Pritzker Laureate of 2016. What a great honor of us to have you here. Alejandro.
Thank you very much, Sangli, for this invitation. I'm going to share just one single project today. No, apparently it's not working. Let me go back. Can you see it? Not yet.
We are seeing a wide screen.
So I need maybe the help from Pascal. What did you do to... So I'm sharing screen in principle. Yeah, okay. Now? Good. So the single project I would like to share with you today is the headquarters for the Inter-American Development Bank in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It's an institution based in Washington, worldwide institution like the World Bank, but for the Americas, North, Central, and South America. And they're planning to have the new regional building in Buenos Aires. And I think this double condition regarding the question, the future for architecture and the future for cities will be both being a magnet and the bomb. A magnet because cities will keep on attracting people. You see here two versions. In the former world, that magnet translates into density, height, and the expression of capitalism. For the informal city, it's another magnet, people coming to cities to look for opportunities of work, health care, education, recreation, and of course, transportation. At the same time, if we don't perform well, cities, because of this concentration, will become ticking time bombs, are already ticking time bombs. In the case of Chile, that bomb already exploded last October, despite, in principle, having a healthy economy. So I guess that the future for architecture and cities will be about being able to deal with 4 crises. The sanitary crisis that we're living today, that has had economic consequences, economic crisis on jobs and work, an environmental crisis, and mainly, maybe that's the case for Latin America, a social crisis, riots, anger, resentment, when inequalities are expressed so concretely and on a daily basis in our cities. So the single project I'm going to show was trying to deal with all these forces at play. One thing, a new headquarters. The IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, doing business as usual, would have chosen a plot in any of the financial districts of the city. But the biggest project they were financing was the upgrading and sanitation for Barrio 31, which is the biggest slum in Buenos Aires, 50,000 people just in front of the formal city. And I think we do have these cases in many places throughout the world. Dharavi in India, 1 million people in front of the financial district. And we have all these tensions coming together in space in many situations. The financing of the World Bank plus the IDB of plus 400 million is to bring sanitation and property rights, the rule of law, into the informal city. I mean, there's 2 recommendations that we've been asked to follow in those last months, you know, stay at home and wash your hands. Well, what if you don't have a house, and what if you don't have running water? So the most simple thing for the say the global north is not necessarily being able to be followed in the informal world, in the majority that Raul was making reference to. So a quick look at this Barrio 31. There's 50,000 people slum. Half of them is immigrants at the very core of Buenos Aires. It started as a low-level, 1-story high slum. It has been consistently growing over more than 100 years to a point that you now have apartment buildings of 6 stories. The most important highway in the city running in between above, and this is the 6 stories high density that the slum has achieved. People living not only close to that highway, but actually underneath the highway as well. And not just housing. I mean, a full economy, a parallel economy of jobs, commerce, even informal educational facilities. Of course, what you see in these pictures is that the scarcest resource in informal cities is not money, but coordination. If every single individual does their own best possible, then they cannot guarantee common good. And that applies to infrastructure for accessibility, circulation. Well, no wonder public space proportion in between private land and public land drops to less than 1:10 in informal settlements, where you informal cities can measure 1:1 or 1:2 ratio. So everybody claiming and trying to do their best, even if well-intentioned, cannot guarantee common good. And that look for opportunities of families, but at the same time creating social conflicts like gangs or drug trafficking are the kind of forces at play that we are dealing while looking for improving our quality of life, but then having to bear very bad living conditions while coming spontaneously into cities. So in a very bold move, the Inter-American Development Bank said, well, what if we build our main building in the slum? The particularity of this slum is that all those 50,000 people go in and out through one single bottleneck, one single entry point close to the train station. And people have to walk for 1 hour to, they cannot even afford public transportation. They walk in average 1 hour to the jobs that are offered by the formal city. Actually, the formal city workforce comes from here, exactly what Rahul was showing in his presentation. And within that hour, of course, you can imagine the amount of anger, resentment that begins to accumulate at the same time that you're dealing with the opportunities that the city concentrates. In the World Bank and IDB improvement of upgrading of the slum, one of the main goals is to eliminate the highway. It will be left there as a kind of elevated public space, being public space discussed as resource, and it will be transferred somewhere else. But if the problem was eliminating barriers, well, we thought that the most important one was the river of trains, how the city calls it, that prevents people to directly walk from the slum to the formal city. Actually, there's no connection, and there's this huge barrier. So, trying to improve the development of the slum, the IDB asked, well, what if we place our own headquarters inside the slum? That is already a very unusual, unexpected, counterintuitive move, particularly for a bank based in Washington. But the president of the bank said, well, it's true that we are a bank, but we are a development bank. So while building our own headquarters, shouldn't we measure and test the amount of development that this project may be able to trigger if we follow the same criteria that we use for financing other projects of infrastructure or sanitation of highways or energy or whatever it is. So let's submit our own building to the same procedure that we use for financing other projects. And after studying that, our conclusion that if the expectation was to trigger development to our own sadness is that we recommended not to do the building in the slum, because it would have been maybe a powerful message, or let's say for PR reasons, maybe good. But in practice, when we were measuring, there was no development being triggered except for the possible white elephant in the future that may have remained a symbol of good intentions, but not triggering in reality the expected development. So we said that could only happen if the city could fulfill 4 conditions. I mean, doing the building just like that in a plot that is given to you won't trigger development unless the city does 4 things. The first one, that it allows the building to be raised on top of the allowed height. That not only was necessary for what I'm going to show next, which is not using the scarcest resource, which is the open public space. I mean, that would have been a disaster that a building lands there and occupies one of the few open spaces that was available in the slum. But it wouldn't even have fulfilled the standards, the minimum standards that are required in Washington for a project to move ahead. Natural light, ventilation, and views. So if the city allows you to raise the building and not touch the ground underneath, then there's 2 conditions are necessary. What's most important, you need to ask for at least 2, for security reasons, at least 2 car connections. I mean, otherwise you won't be able to even have the meetings. This bank is not a commercial bank. I mean, it works doing lendings and borrowing money to governments, to countries. So they have 250 meetings a year in the building with ministers and presidents for security reasons. You have to have escape routes, and to mention a very specific request for the bank. But in addition, your workers, I mean, how do they come in and go out at work? What about at night, security issues? So at least a pedestrian connection, direct pedestrian connection should be done to the formal city, to public transportation, so on and so forth. The problem that the city had not the money, nor the jurisdiction to be able to operate there. So we said, well, don't do the building unless, and this was the tipping point in the project, what if the building, instead of asking for 4 conditions, the building is the 4 conditions? So we said, if we put the square meters that you're planning to build anyhow, not in a plot inside the slum, but as a bridge in between the formal and the informal city, by not touching the ground and actually just the railroads, you have to be elevated for the required clearance. The part landing in the formal city takes advantage that on the other side of the railroads is the convention center, and the parking and public transportation is the subway, actually. So it's a national connection. Also is one of the escape routes for security reasons. Your security experts may give the benefit of the doubt to this project. On the other hand, it will touch the slum, but given we have to leave 18-meter free clearance, we'll have to have mechanical systems to go on top of the bridge. What if you allow people to use your own vertical circulation system so that this bit becomes a pedestrian connection from one side to the other one? We're talking about a 240-meter long bridge with a central span of 110 meters. So when working with SBP, the German structural engineers with which we were already working for a project in Qatar, they said, fine, we can solve the structure of 240-meter long bridge with 110 meters span. The problem is not the structure, is the vibration. Because in a bridge, you don't realize you're in a car, but it vibrates. It will be very uncomfortable for working on top. So even though it was counterintuitive, they said we need weight. So we put a park on top of the bridge to the weight that was needed to lower the vibration, and that it was improving. That was the scarcest quality of life element that the slum was missing. So as you see here, the escalators on both ends that also had the structural capacity to stabilize the building inside is mainly a big truss within which the bank was expected to work. And the interesting thing, and while measuring value here, and this is how we use the bank's own method of measuring value. In the current situation, within 1 hour, people walking, this is the amount of opportunities of health, education, cultural recreation they have access to, and mainly around 300,000 jobs. By building the bridge and creating this shortcut, within the same hour of walking, you multiply by 4 the available work offer, health institutions by 10, education, and the same numbers. And so these, in the end, I would say, are the kind of operations one may use to dismantle the social ticking time bomb, make the opportunities available to cities. That's why they even came to the cities in the first place. So it was not an easy sell for the board in Washington. This is how it looked at the ground level. But given we have to be at plus 18 meters because of the train clearance, this was an easier way to sell that the view of the city. And once you frame that with the structure, the beam, inhabited beam of the bridge, they kind of relax, and there was a moment of relief in the board meeting in Washington. But then, of course, the amount of development that was able to trigger not only for the slum, but also for the formal city. This is a beneficial, a win-win situation for the both ends of the social structure of society. And again, the way you walk, that same hour, not walking through infrastructure and waste, but through a park. Luckily enough, we're coming from Chile, from a very seismic country, and Argentina has no earthquakes. This was finally some benefit for us, and this is how we expected the building to look like. One just minor thing had to be solved. We had to pass a new law in the Congress to be able to use the air rights above the railroads. On the jurisdiction of the city, you can build whatever you want. This is a city land but the national infrastructure is as a country level, so it's a federal structure that requires a different law. The problem with Argentinian politics is normally the government of the city and the government of the country are opposing political parties, so they tend to block projects each other. And we had a 2-year window of opportunity because the president of the country and the mayor of Buenos Aires were of the same coalition, and they calculated they had an advantage of 2 votes to pass the law. So we submitted the project in a first reading and in a second reading, and to everybody's surprise, the new law for using air rights above national federal infrastructure won 42-12. And I guess that this is the proof that designed power to channel forces instead of resisting them or fighting them. How you can use synthesis of design enabled to bring into agreement the kind of forces that are, you know, under pressure in the cities was what I guess that it was a kind of to everybody an unexpected outcome. So even more unexpected things have happened. The pandemic, new president in Argentina, just a new president of the IDB appointed by Trump in Washington. So we're again in a moment of waiting what would happen. But I guess that even with that, the new law was passed, is if not the bank, other institution now may be able to bridge over infrastructure to connect the informal and the formal city. That's it. Thank you.
This is absolutely fantastic, Alejandro. Extremely powerful project, extremely powerful idea as always. The empathy and the passion involved in design like this are simply irresistible. Thank you very much indeed, and all the best to the future of the project and to that law.
Fingers crossed.
Okay, so we move on to the last speaker tonight or this afternoon, Winnie Mas. Winnie Mas is a Dutch architect, landscape architect, professor and urbanist. He is the co-founder and the principal architect of MVRDV, an interdisciplinary studio that works at the intersection of architecture and urbanism. Winnie Mas is also Professor of Urbanism and Architecture at the Delft University of Technology and Director of the Y Factory. Ladies and gentlemen, Winnie Mas.
Wow, thank you very much, Zhang Li. Thank you, Rahul, Alejandro, and Pascal for your wonderful lectures. And I see a new kind of architectural movement here going on, a kind of new SIAM, where we share probably certain kind of objectives to handle certain problems in the world. I will share you my screen. I hope this works. Can you see it? Yes, fine, Zhang? Okay. I would like to share also one project, but it's called Green Dip, and it's somehow kind of aggressive action to add oxygen to the planet and maybe to kill some viruses. I would like to share today, of course, your special day, a report basically from Rotterdam, where the depot has just been, say, primarily opened, especially on the moment of Corona crisis, just to go on with economy, go on with being together on a 1.5 meter distance. So you have seen it maybe somewhere in some of your newspapers lately, and also the New York Times gave a kind of heads up for this, because somehow this building created a nicer skyline than the New York one by enlarging the Rotterdam skyline by coincidence in this way. Some of you might be already shared what happens today and yesterday on Instagram and other media. Here you can see it, what we try to do at the moment in Rotterdam, a small, say, open public facility to open actually all the archives and share with you and everybody the beauty of the hidden treasures. And but of course it's a refrigerator, and it has no windows almost because of the. So we try to make the building relatively small, have a kind of say a forest on the roof, and somehow a reflective environment, so that the park and the city somehow becomes bigger as such. So what happens, then just a couple of hours ago, walking over the street, seeing the mirroring effect of you get 2 sunsets, 3 sunrises gratuitously in every apartment that surrounds it. And how it somehow start to engage with the city by not looking similar to any building. It simply wants to be. So here a phrase of the doors, how they are, as we speak, are at the moment closing because of the time which is there, and how it then opens itself again in the evening, in the night, in the morning, in the coming time. The true opening of the building is not this weekend, but will be in a year from now, after having installed all the art, all the treasures of the Dutch and say population inside. So we can take from there a journey through the building, which is basically a sorting machine that you can see here, a glimpse of it, and then reach the roof, where we can share not only Rotterdam, but also in kind of instant mini forest, where I hope that we can test basically the species, how to make it higher up, like Stefano also is doing in Milano. And I see Alejandro also trying to make a jump on this, to create like a space for people, but also a space to breathe as such. This will be coincide with the next year also with a massive plantation of a forest that surrounds it, so that we can here imagine a kind of resurrected forest in this mirage or mirroring environment that we try to create. That's this weekend. Tomorrow I will be here in Amsterdam, because I have to try to sometime to work on this CBD, which is quite an ugly element. I mean, it resembles pieces of Buenos Aires indeed, and it is but what to do with that. So we are given this volume. Yeah, you know these rules. You make a plinth and some towers on top. And only thing which we could do is basically erase the towers in such a way with a scripting tool, so that we can make bay windows and cavities that allow for plantation, but also for stairs, and that bring you now in the nearby future from the bottom to the top, so that somehow we can imagine this kind of green valley. Here you see a model of it, how we convinced the environment and the client to make that kind of breathing act as a kind of also taking simply the architecture of the CBD, but carve it away to give space for what I think is a green dip. So some renders that help to that, and how it can look to the soccer fields next door, turning it into a kind of a stage set under construction these days. Where this is currently happening now, and where we can start to see how the stairs are coming up, how we can carve out the building and add things for any apartment and any, say, function as a mixed usage building that ultimately lead to this kind of proximity of people and plants and animals that are then, say, carved into this building. So with the opening next year in February, in September, of the depot, the final opening, also this building will be opened. And I do hope that COVID is over then, so that we can gather each other on the stairs and on these roofs in the next episode. This is what a client shows on its website, which I find fabulous. That this is kind of a dream that Amsterdam could actually become into a marriage with Switzerland, Pascal, and that somehow we can then start to imagine a kind of a coverage of the planet with a new biome as such. Of course, this reminds me of Seoul, where, and I think that Alejandro proposes that also, when you have a kind of city like this, and with infrastructure that span, but use that infrastructure to greenify the city and to connect out and to reach out to the city. You have seen the pictures, but I want to end with what happens this week in this garden that has been made as where you can walk around. It's actually an arboretum where all the species are tested, how they can grow in artificial circumstances, and how from A till Z, but then in the Korean alphabet, you can walk around and find the test result of all these species in the heart of Seoul, and then spanning out. What is nice, I think, is now that the next step is undertaken of a couple of, say, competitions that will start. One for 10 streets that span out from this bridge into the neighborhoods, and secondly, for 2 projects that are helping the Lotte warehouse and the conference center that lead to hopefully this extension the coming year, and then later in 2030 to this. And then I think we beat Seoul because of its image a little bit, and then it starts to breathe more. I'm happy that also Tainan is somehow functioning, again, kind of laboratory in Taiwan. They think it's a green city. Well, it's not. This is how it looks like. And we were tackled by the government to help for streets, but also to change certain buildings into kind of lung of the city. This was the Chinese department store that we knocked down. Not all of them, like to keep many pieces of the debris, to keep the weight, because it's in the sea actually, and also to turn it in the end into a lagoon that would cool the city. And so with the dream that you could swim in the ruins of the past is what it wants to be. So here you see the first tests before the opening, and still, so we just opened it in, what is it, February, so just before COVID-19. But this is pictures from yesterday, how people are working on it and in it, how they swim at certain cases. And I want to show it also because we use the different levels in the water, not only for cooling this environment, but cooling also the city, but also get a kind of dengue-proof appropriation. So with the species that are there, some knowledge is now there how to deal in that way with dengue as a disease. And I know there are more of them, and Raoul, you showed it beautifully with all the malarias and cholera. And I think we have to study what we can do on that in the coming time. This leads us, this is as an introduction to the Green Dip that we try to now to stage more in the Y Factory, a book that comes out soon, and that tries to investigate a little bit what is the effect of this kind of activities and to extend that to the future. I mean, there is a dream, of course, that this is not only happening in Europe and or now in Argentina, but also in Hong Kong, that this would be a wonderful Hong Kong, I could imagine, where you would make it even more greener than the mountains. Or when you have Beijing, and I worked, of course, at Ram's office a while ago, I think it could be much better when we do, when I do the landscaping at that moment in the CBD of Beijing. So we're talking about the Beijing Biennale, and I was trying to talk in the introduction on getting the mountains to the city, cool down Beijing, reducing the streets, and give it back then to this kind of massive plantation. Then I think you would have a fantastic climate in the summer, and you would have a way of getting rid of the dust and say the pollutants in the other parts of the time. That's my solicitation for Beijing. In order to do that, I think we need not only governments, we need each other to do that. And that's, I think, the SIAM that we are just talking about is a little bit referring to that. So this green maker that I hope to bring on the internet soon is basically like a calculator to use all the species that I can imagine, learn from the Netherlands and from Korea, learn from Tainan and from mainland China, to give them, to select them, to sort them, to see what they do and what they need, and in all the species, and what they could contribute to the world and to the economy. We can do that in different technologies, from deeper and flatter, and then we can see any, say, canvas that I can imagine. So I opened one here in this case, New York. I like it quite a lot. It's a nice place. And what can we do if we select, for instance, certain kind of elements that we cover the roofs? If we insert other kind of elements and we cover the facades, and we cover with other elements all, say, the streets in between the taxis, how can we do that? Then you have a Manhattan, which I would like much more in that way, and that would actually produce cooling. It would be a cooler city at the moment to help to generate some kind of contribution. So it goes from, I would say, egoism in that way, which has dictated Manhattan, to a certain kind of we-goism. It gives responsibility to the city and adds to something more than this kind of individualism that is there. So here, a kind of small film, how it would look like. This is Fifth Avenue, better shopping, I would say, and how the shops and the apartments are contributing to it, not only in the exterior, also in pieces of the interior, and that can lead to this kind of green York. So after New York, the next York could imagine in itself. So I really would like to invite the New Yorkers to make this city and to make the next day beauty and a reference, because yeah, New York is our reference, no, in terms of urbanism in that way. But Dubai can do it also. Here, a film how I can imagine that with cactuses I can improve the hotels over there and turn it into actually a fantastic Fata Morgana in the desert as such, that occupies and makes it Dubai 2.0 at that moment to create actually clouds in the end over the city. And also, Rahul, this is for you, to also dream about Mumbai, where of course the water and to keep the water at many places in Mumbai, to penetrate it with ficus benjaminas everywhere, so that somehow we can imagine a kind of new kind of Mumbai at that moment. Is what this is celebrating as such. Of course, we go on. We need, because this is not only for oxygen and for cooling, it's also for animals in a way. And I invite my next clients' animals also to participate in this operation. Here, the next book the Y Factory is producing, basically like calculating what is the habitat calculator. So if you have a food chain between a wolf and a mice, and so then you know how much cubic meters and square meters it needs to. If you then program that and parameterize that and put and analyze current, say, environments, then and you put it again on the canvases with new products, say from skins to toilets, where this kind of cohabitation could happen, so that natural enemies of dengue will also penetrate these environments, because I think we cannot do it alone as human beings to get rid of all the diseases. We need to help the help of the environment who did that. And then you see here some kind of products that are now developed by the students, and then leads to this kind of coverages, beautiful walls where foxes can climb up, that they can go over the roofs and meet their friends that are hiding in that way, and also continue on the streets. Then I think cities become truly beautiful. And here, a North French modest city like Lille could then become somewhere active in how it would participate in this new kind of biology. As a result, if we would do that all over the planet with any building in that way, then for sure we reduce carbon emissions insanely in that all over it. And it also helps already to get rid of the temperature drop of 1 Celsius. We could imagine with that half of the operation could be done by that activity. I know I'm far off, but I think it would help. To end with, I think this is a technique that started. It has been done by many of my colleagues, which I love and adore. I only want to help them to make them, to give it a stage set. If you look to the timeline and I see what can happen in the kind of biotechnology that we are aiming at, and yes, also the ETH is doing that, Pascal, so that we have to work together more closely, and that we move, say, from concrete gradually into wood and then into bio-transformable material, then I can start to imagine that this is Rotterdam section, and how in the coming 20 years it can move on into this kind of, say, transformable, adaptable, and resilient environment where I could then answer also the ephemeral question of Rahul by having a complete adaptable bio-city over time. And then Avatar would be actually cute when I compare that to my future. And that would transform the city from a blue one into a green one at that moment, which cools also the desert and also stores the water of India in its massive, say, sponge that we then create together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Winnie. As provocative as always. It reminds of two things, and one is that when combined with new typologies, creative iconography actually is a positive force in the transition of cities. And the second thing actually is what we are currently debating in Beijing, is that the future of the city might not only be a return to nature, but also probably a return to wilderness. Thank you very much indeed for these provocative ideas. Now we are going to start the Q&A session. There are quite a number of questions posted in the Q&A area in this Zoom meeting room. First, please allow me to abuse my right as the moderator. I would skip all the questions regarding Alejandro's hairstyle.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
You must have answered it for probably thousands of times. Not today. I will start with a question to Pascal. It's been asked by Carmen Xu. Could you please explain more about how the idea of time was moved out in the last project in your presentation?
Yeah, well, I guess it was not really the last project I showed, but eventually there's this building in concrete. I mean, basically I don't know if it really fits the discussion we're having here, but the idea there in this project is that that building does not look like a contemporary building, because I think most of the contemporary buildings built in northern Italy look very ugly. And basically because they look new and basically the way they look. So I tried to make a building that looks very old from the beginning. And to make it old, there was kind of two reasons. One is I tried to take away all the like the light switches and every little plastics that indicates time. And the other one was that the material of the building itself already looks like a ruin. So it looks like that you cannot really date it.
Thank you, Pascal. And a question to Rahul. It is asked by Chen Tu-yi. The question is, you suggested that due to the development way is impermanent, we should create a way in order to adapt to the situation. So I would like to ask, could we imagine or not in the future temporary architecture, such as houses made by container, will be a new fashion in India and other developing countries?
Well, I mean, I think my provocation and suggestion is not about, one or the other. It's not about either the temporary or the permanent as solutions, but how one deploys them strategically and makes space for both of them. And I mean, my argument was really that permanence is not the solution, temporality or temporary is not the solution, how we find that middle ground. And I mean, I think the way to understand it, which is what has been very inspiring by the presentations collectively, is through also looking at how each of those questions are asked at different scales. You know, and how those feedback loops are created. And so for me, you know, I mean, if you took the smallest scale, I think I was very inspired, as I've said already a couple of times, by Pascal's, you know, last project, because that sort of addressed just taking the typology, but kind of creating feedback loops which inform other ways of living, for example. I mean, I think as an extension of that, and in relation also to Alejandro Zarapaula's presentation about the two lines and the complexities that lie between them, which technology drives ahead of architects. For me, Winnie Maas's Amsterdam project is very inspiring, because what he really does is he thickens that envelope to accommodate the green. And so it's not about just cladding that's driven by vendors, but it's an architect actually modulating space there to create an other kind of performative dimension to the facade, right? Then if you go up to the middle scale, I mean, you know, Alejandro's building demonstrates that so beautifully, where the forces of the favelas, the connections to the city, the job employments, all the forces at the middle scale coalesce to kind of produce a piece of architecture, right? And then one can, of course, go to national scales and create, I mean, I think what Vinny took us to the planetary scale, and then I think learning from that provocation, you can go back and inform every building quite differently, right? So the interconnectedness of those scales, and across that spectrum, us using our judgments collectively to decide what might be appropriately deployed for what situation at what scale, is, I think, how one creates modulation between what are temporary and permanent imaginations, and what are solutions that address a temporal scale, and are short-term solutions or are transitionary solutions, and ones that we feel will create more permanent end states. So it's a much more complicated modulation rather than answering it with temporary or permanent.
Thank you, Raul. A question to Alejandro. How to maintain the spatial aesthetic value of architecture and its social responsibility? The question is asked by someone anonymous in the audience.
I guess that what's behind there is to understand that the nature of the question that architecture has to deal with has measurable components, very concrete, down-to-earth things that you have to comply with, constraints, budget, laws, political frameworks, and that, of course, is a necessary condition, but it's not enough. There are the intangible dimensions of the human conditions that are necessary to be incorporated, even though they may be hard to measure. Actually, these may be the most important ones, because the emotional, the symbolic dimension of architecture is at the very core of these forces that sometimes can become violent. I mean, you can prove that economically you're not dying out of hunger, yet the inequalities, the fear, the fear that the pandemic triggered, or the envy that inequalities triggered, or the ambition in a good sense that is a big driver. So these emotional dimensions have to be integrated. And if there's any power in design, that's the power of synthesis. The more complex the question, the more the need for synthesis. And I guess that architecture can offer to society that at its very core, what we've seen in the presentations today is the ability to synthesize complex issues and organize information in a proposal key. Like when doing a sketch, you know, when you're sketching reality, is not all the lines that you see. It's the few that are more fundamental. If you drew everything, then you would have a black page. So you have to pick up what's more relevant. And I guess that strategic capacity of understanding what of the reality, anchored in constraints and restrictions, and understanding and speaking the language of how the system and the world works. But then if you only fall onto that part, then you may fall short. on the other end of the spectrum, thinking out of the box. I mean, thinking about the potential and possibilities. But if not anchored in the reality and procedures, then you're going to be the crazy one just doing funny stuff. How to balance the two expected dimensions, to know what you're talking about, understanding constraints, yet not being only a consequence of that, imagining a possible future. And for that, I would say architecture's synthesis capacity, the fact that you can show how it looks in the future, not only for aesthetic reasons, but to be able to capture decision maker and civil society's imagination, may be a way.
Thank you, Alejandro. A question to Winnie, and also asked by someone anonymous. How did you solve the flare and glare issue of the first project using that highly reflective surface?
Wow, that's practical. The okay, we have been monitoring the amount of dead birds in that building to see how much will die against the mirror. The curvature of the building, the building is curved, so everything is double or triple curved of the glass, and we compare that with the straight building on top in that way, and with a building next door, a glass building, to see that. The amount of dead buildings in the neighboring buildings was substantially higher than the curved buildings. So somehow now with biologists, the curvature helps that the birds go just away before they are going to attack the building. So that's one. Secondly, the glare is also monitored. So that's very right. There are positions in the city where, say, actually people are not allowed to look into a garden next door, which is run by psychiatric institute, and where people should not look into that. There's also like an inverse glare, you can say. So we made like a cloud on top of it with a film, so that to monitor exactly the spots where you don't want to have a view or where you don't want to have glare. And that adds a kind of a nuance to the positions where you want to have glare, namely extra sunrise or sunsets, and where you want to have this kind of mirroring aspect. So that gives maybe an answer to you, and also an answer to what Alejandro was saying, that we all are in a kind of world of paradoxes, and that we have the power of synthesis to span the gap between the different opinions that surround our buildings. So I think it's a good illustration of that. To add to that, I think today's group of people, us 4 or 5, I love what Raúl says, the positive way of using the word provocation, because there are many cultures in the world that see provocation as something negative, as a kind of insulting activity. I think today's all of us, I think, show basically that we can only enlarge certain subjects, and we can only go beyond the building as an object to by a certain kind of provocation, by showing that in order to reach heaven or reach better circumstances, from poverty to oxygen, that we need somehow this kind of enlargement, this kind of to show basically how to solve this. So I would like to stress Raúl's observation on that.
Thank you, Winnie. The following question is being asked to Raúl and Alejandro at the same time. It has been asked by David Blanco. He said, I am a Guatemalan student living in Spain, but I am aware of the different limitations of the societies of the third world countries, and even more in this kind of life we have now. For a better development for the people, it is important for different environment professionals to be part of the politics or the way we can plan the future. How can we integrate between different types of societies to help each other? As Raúl said, we are the majorities of the world, but we are not the ones who make the decisions. as Alejandro said, in these different times, not everyone has access to prevent to what is happening. It is important for architects. Is it important for architects to take part in this?
Go ahead,
Alejandro.
Start. Yeah. Sorry. You going ahead? You want me to go ahead?
Oh, no, please.
Okay, thanks. Well, I mean, first of all, I want to say to the student that, I mean, don't start by saying we don't make the decisions. I mean, I think everyone makes the decisions. You're at the cutting edge and you're transformative where you are. And I think that's very important. You know, there are many ways to answer that question. I mean, only because the person identified them as a student, I would say, you know, one way I kind of like to explain this, at least to another generation, is through the notion of, you know, what is our sphere of concern and what is our sphere of influence. And I think one of the problems with a younger generation, at least I see as a teacher, is that our spheres of concern are expanding incredibly fast. And our spheres of influence are diminishing incredibly fast. And I think we have to find a way that we can calibrate these at the same level, which is not to say that we shouldn't diminish our concerns, but we should find new ways of increasing our influence. Because when those two spheres intersect and overlap, I think we get agency as architects. The problem is we are not addressing them simultaneously. So we have a free fall of ideas, which are all our concerns, from climate change to poverty to everything which goes planetary. But then we don't find new ways of creating that influence for those concerns. And so society doesn't take us seriously. So I think that is key. And of course, education, pedagogy, models of practice, all play a great role. I happened to yesterday have 24 hours ago exactly, have a wonderful conversation with Alejandro about forms of patronage and how we spoke about how do we understand even a client that's linked to our sphere of influence. And we have to start unpacking even the entity of a client because, and I mean, just to simplify it, I'm sorry to be repetitive, I'm apologizing to Alejandro, is, we have a client is actually a patron, it's an operational client, it's a user client. We often only identify with one of those, but how do we as a bridge practice create feedback loops between these different forms of the client? And every building, except for a single family house where it's at the most a couple, and most other projects, if you start looking at it critically, the client becomes a very complex entity. And really, the only way we can increase that sphere of influence is understand the client in these much more nuanced ways, because they're really like constituencies. This is what politicians do. They understand their constituencies in really complex ways and begin to rile them up, begin to mobilize them, begin to get a pulse and address their issues. As architects, we've lost track of how that is done, I think. And I think, so this bringing of our spheres of influence and our spheres of concern in a much more calibrated consonance is, I think, key to becoming and contributing to society more meaningfully.
Yeah, I would add to that in order to participate in a bigger conversation and to avoid the risk of irrelevance, that I guess that we architects are always risking, to be doing things that nobody cares about except other architects. So I guess that the first thing in order to engage in a conversation that society is interested in is to speak the languages of the forces at play. You don't have to become a politician, but have to understand the language of politics. You don't have to be an economist, but have to know how to read numbers and understand what are the forces there. The same thing with social issues, environmental issues, not to mention psychology or collective emotions. So I would say that, to put it very simple, when you enter a project, shut up and listen. Just do not want too early. Do not want anything, actually, as if possible. Do not come with an excuse. Oh, here I have an opportunity to build something I have in my sketchbook, and I'm just looking for the excuse. avoid wanting too early. But on the contrary, do not postpone it too much. After a couple of, you can't be in endless diagnosis. At some point, you need to jump into the void and take the risk of making a proposal. And that moment of proposal doing, I would say it's a very powerful thing in architecture. If we don't engage in a broader conversation, it's not just a problem for us because we're not getting jobs. It's a problem for society because complex issues require some tools that are able to deal with complexity. And design's power of synthesis, as I was saying before, is one of them. It would be a pity for society that we do not participate and come and participate in a bigger conversation with a powerful tool that is at the very core of our practice. So once you've shut up, say something meaningful. That's how I would put it.
Thank you so much, Alejandro and Raul. And next question is to Winnie. It's about the use of computers. It has been asked by Xie Yantung. It seems that Green Maker is a great tool to help city designers with their green landscape. However, do you think the ecosystem is too complicated to be simulated by computers? How do we convert those computer algorithms into real life in terms of getting the world greener again?
Thank you for the question. This is, if there's one useful meaning for computation, is then that we can use it as a mirror to natural science, and that we understand more and better all the complexities of the world. I think the sanitation measurements of today are, say, stressing that in that way. Can we mimic? Nah, that's the complexity, is indeed huge. Can we make mistakes? Yes. And we have done already a lot of mistakes by having too much monocultures in our plantations, by avoiding water management systems in our cities. So there is and we can only through this kind of extended knowledge, say, make that better in the future and create hopefully a constructive balance again between urbanism and the planet. So I would plead, therefore, for a massive, say operation of universities to understand that better, to collaborate with biologists and geologists to make that models, that computer models, to make that software, to understand that better. I think we are already a little bit late on that, and I expect. Raul, maybe you can help at Harvard a little bit, but that we can push that situation stronger, so that we make this kind of labs that can make that better. But there's a world to go in that way. We can. It's not only the management that we can understand through that. It's also in the end also the maybe a new materialization that we can compose out of that, from the nanotechnology to, see what I already said, from to lead it, the concrete of the current times, to a kind of biological material. So also that can help to explore the knowledge of biology and of ecology as such. And yes, it's complex, but yes, we are not stupid, and we have a lot of facilities to do that.
Thank you very much, Winnie. A question to Pascal is from Jenny. Is a very tectonic question. I like the concrete walls you've created, which I can feel the calm and the peaceful emotion the building delivers. The question I have here is, if we want to create a very natural and elegant concrete wall surface inside the building, and since we do not want to use any coating materials, what concrete material and application method would you suggest?
Well, I basically think we should stop using concrete as much as possible. And I think, I was talking in the beginning of the lecture, I think we haven't talked about reuse. I think it would be interesting to reuse existing buildings as such already and eventually continue them, or it would be interesting to reuse pieces and eventually reassemble them, and then eventually we can use concrete again. But I think it's a bit as Vinny says, I think we need new materials also. We need new techniques. I also think, by the way, we should look at new typologies where we just use less square meters per person used. We also need low high tech in buildings. We need new ways that we just use less energy to run our buildings. And the entire issue on sponge cities, that we have to try to find a way to keep the water at the place and let it evaporate in summer. I think that are kind of some key elements on a very concrete way of how to build on the level of materials.
Thank you, Pascal. We have about a dozen more questions in the list, but I'm very sorry, we are running out of time. So we will ask a question to all the speakers that have been asked by many people already. Since we are running out of time, so maybe may I request each of you to answer this question very briefly. The question is, post-pandemic city, what changes are we going to see? Maybe we start with Winnie.
Sorry, I was trying to write down when you were speaking to go to kind of conclusions. But it's first I would like to stress that that it will be very good that all the Q&A that you, after zooming out, that we then that you distribute that to everybody, because indeed the questions are very nice that many people have been asking, from small to big. Secondly, I think also you as organizations, Amalie, I do hope that you can bring this conversation also to a kind of manifesto, because I do think that things are getting quite, not completely cohesive, because I'm not pleading for that, but I do think that we share more than we think, and that is and that needs to find a global direction. Thirdly, I thanks Pascal for today voting for open borders in Switzerland. I'm very happy that I was very worried, and I think that's also an answer to one of the questions that has been asked earlier today. Open borders are super important in the future, despite all the effects that it might have, in order to get a kind of open world for that. So that I want to stress. And so these are already answers for the post-academic question, Zhang-Li, that you propose. Because post-academic means that we have to find environments where we can be sanitary, where we try to make it in all levels healthy as much as possible, that we somehow team up with all the virus researchers that are over the planet to see what kind of cities is needed to facilitate that in that way. I'm also aware that when we have found virus killers, that I'm afraid for the hedonism that can suddenly appear. Party time becomes then again over the planet with all its, which can lead to insane momentums as such. But the best thing we can do is, while talking today also with each other, to construct, construct that city and that world where we can, which becomes greener, which wants to solve the bigger problems of today. So we cannot concentrate only on the post-COVID. We have to do it now and speed up. And it has been said by many that maybe some of the COVID issues have actually stressed the need for a healthy and green city. So let's not wait for that momentum and do it now, even in this virtual situations that we share with each other now. But I'm very happy that such a wide group on every time zone in the world now, that we try to somehow connect. I'm aware it's the next Coca-Cola advertisement, like share the world, but it's and a bit cheap in a way. But that's what I notate as such.
Thank you, Winnie. Pascal.
Well, what I find interesting is, in a certain way, this COVID and somehow concludes in moving less on every aspect, and which kind of reflects quite some ideas we also talked on, that the climate change issue. And I fully agree with Vinnie Mas, talking about that exchange is actually more used than ever, or more, I don't know, more used than ever, but it's really used, that we commonly find solutions together. So again, I see kind of a strange, or not a strange, I see a contradiction in somehow becoming quite local, and also a very big need of exchanging. And I think, for example, this Zoom meeting today is a very good example of something that eventually also came out because of COVID.
Thank you, Pascal. Raul.
Thank you. No, I mean, I think a lot has been said. I think just building on these comments, and I think somebody said earlier that once COVID goes, probably our work relationships will change, but the cities will kind of go back sort of to normal, or that was a speculation. And I think if I were to frame it, and again, building on these comments, I would say the fundamental change is going to occur in the way we imagine the home and the home in the world. And by that, I mean, I think the home has already, at least for me personally, but I can see it, has gained a value and a preciousness which is immense. I think for all of us, we are blessed that we had that as an asset, let's just say, but I think we've also realized how valuable it is for humanity. And so the whole conversation about what that means, I think we have to resituate. I think we took it too much for granted. And as I've described it, the home had become the transient place, and the world had become our most stable entity. In the COVID, it has reversed. The home has suddenly become very stable, and the world has become transient. Just in the fact, as Pascal said, we are having this conversation, and we'll at the end hit leave, and we'll all disappear into space. If we were doing this in Beijing, we would have had a wonderful meal and spoken for hours after that to each other. So somehow the world has become, but that offers a possibility, and it offers a great potential. And I think Vinnie touched upon this because he took us to a planetary scale. It allows us to connect in new relationships. It allows us to work on new forms of the common, and it allows us to now solve problems in a completely different way, which is not bound by nationality, not bound by hard borders, but is much more fluid, and hopefully something will come out of it, while the home will, I think, become stable.
Yeah, I would say that it would be important not to lose perspective. We already live in post-pandemic cities. Pandemics has happened several times throughout the history. And this is just another one. So we're already learned. I mean, sanitation, access to water, introduction of ventilation. So we have learned already. This is another lesson that we had to incorporate. So it's not new. In that sense, I would say that the force of coming together, we are a gregarious species, and that will still be a very powerful reason for living together. Maybe small definitions. Overcrowding is not the same thing as density. Density is fine, is not a problem. Overcrowding is something to be avoided because it's a death threat. So these kind of nuances are the ones that we will have to integrate in our vocabulary. And the same way we understand that an earthquake or a tsunami is a recurrent phenomenon, well, pandemics are the same way. The key is that where do we shelter? Where do we go for the moment of peak in the threat? That we do have shelters in earthquakes, or we prepare ourselves for tsunamis. Well, the same thing for pandemics. If we will have to go back again to our house and wash our hands, well, make sure to have a house and have running water so that we're prepared until science advances and is able to bring us all back together again, because in our very nature, I think, will still be the need to physically meet, face-to-face contact, and that's how humanity has advanced, by meeting, and we will have to make sure to create the right conditions for that.
Thank you, Alejandro. I would like to say we are coming close to the second half of this forum. If the first half of this forum was marked by optimism and technology and innovation, and the second half is actually marked by deep reflection and resilience. Thank you very much for your insight and empathy that has brought us back to the architecture's relation with the entirety of humanity. I'm sure everyone in the audience will leave this Zoom meeting a little bit smarter than 3 hours ago. So thank you very much indeed for enlightening us. We can't do a round of applause like we are inside an audience hall, but I'm sure the biggest reward would be that we will see each other face to face very soon again. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Super nice.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye.
Such a great honor.